The silver tray arrived before the first toast, and every candle in Wetherbourne House seemed to lean toward it, as if light itself wished to read the accusation before the bride did. London, April 1816, had given Winifred Aveling a morning fit for a duchess. The bells of St. George's, Hanover Square, had rung through a pale spring haze. The church steps had been swept clean. Her ivory gown had carried a modest fall of lace at the wrists. Her veil had been pinned without fuss, and in the narrow privacy before the ceremony she had tucked a small bridal prayer card into her prayer book with a pressed sprig of myrtle marking the page. It had been her mother's old custom, whispered to her years ago, when Winifred was still young enough to believe that marriage was entered by the heart before it was negotiated by families. By noon, she was Her Grace, the Duchess of Wetherbourne. By 3 o'clock, half the room would be wondering whether she had earned exile before her wedding gloves had warmed to her hands. The Duke of Wetherbourne stood beside her beneath the high plaster ceiling of his London house, tall, controlled, and grave in black and white. Elias Deverick had not smiled at the altar, but he had not been cruel when Winifred had stepped from the church into the waiting carriage. The hem of her gown had caught for one perilous second beneath her shoe. His gloved fingers had closed lightly over hers to steady her. Not possessively, not warmly, only with exact restraint, as if he understood that even help could become a claim if offered without care. She had looked up and found his eyes upon her, dark grey and unreadable, but not indifferent. The contact had lasted no longer than a breath. Still, something foolish and human had moved inside her. Perhaps, she had thought, a marriage arranged by others might yet leave room for kindness. Now that same hand rested near his untouched champagne glass while a footman placed the silver tray before him. The breakfast room was full of family, rank, silk, and expectation. Dowager Duchess Deverick sat near the hearth with a face like carved ivory. Sir Dorian Aveling, Winifred's elder brother, lifted his glass too often and smiled too little. Lady Althea Marstow, pale and perfect in lavender, stood near the wedding gifts with the kind of stillness that asked to be admired. Servants moved with practiced invisibility. Relatives spoke in careful half-laughter. The new duchess was supposed to receive compliments, not judgment. Elias broke the black seal on the folded paper. Winifred saw his expression change before she knew why. It was a small change, almost nothing. The line of his mouth hardened. His gaze passed once across the page, then returned to the top, as if the first reading had been impossible. Dorian lowered his glass. Lady Althea drew in a quiet breath. "Your Grace?" the Dowager asked. Elias did not answer at once. The silence spread. It touched the porcelain plates, the sugared fruits, the silver knives, the white roses banked along the sideboard. Winifred felt the room turn toward her before anyone spoke her name. Elias looked up. "Did you sign this?" She had been Duchess for less than 3 hours, yet the title in his voice already sounded like a door closing. "I cannot answer until I know what it is." "An instruction," he said, addressed to the steward at Larkmead Priory. "It orders the removal of 6 tenant families from cottages adjoining the North Ridge." A faint murmur passed through the room. Winifred stared at him, not understanding the shape of the accusation, only feeling its shadow fall over her. "I have signed no such instruction." Elias held the page more firmly. "It bears your initials." "Then they are false. It bears reference to your brother's proposed mineral lease." Every word struck more sharply because he did not raise his voice. Winifred turned to Dorian. What lease? Dorian's colour shifted, then recovered behind wounded dignity. My dear Winifred, you must not look at me as if I have placed the ink upon that page. I told you only that Larkmead had prospects. You were the one determined not to enter marriage empty-handed. The lie was so swift, so polished, that for 1 second she could only look at him, her own brother. Blood, name, childhood, Christmas dinners in cold rooms, and the last of their mother's letters tied in blue thread. He did not blink. Lady Althea's voice slipped in softly. Surely there must be some misunderstanding. A bride may be eager to prove useful in her new station. Useful. The word landed with delicate poison. Winifred felt heat climb beneath her veil. Around her, eyes lowered and lifted, calculating how much scandal could be witnessed without appearing hungry for it. I did not write it, she said. I did not authorize it. I do not know which tenants are named. Elias set the directive back upon the tray. The cottages are listed, Widow Bellwether among them. A woman near the windows made a faint sound of disapproval. Not at the forged paper, at Winifred. Widow, Winifred repeated. You believe I would order a widow out of her home on my wedding morning? His gaze held hers. Something in it flickered, but pride moved faster than doubt. I believe documents do not walk unassisted into my house. Nor do lies, she said quietly. The room tightened. Dorian gave a soft, theatrical sigh. Winifred, I beg you, do not make this worse. I am trying, she said, still looking at Elias, to prevent it from becoming worse than falsehood. The Duke's hand closed once, then opened. He had the look of a man standing before a fire he could not decide whether to smother or feed. Where were you before the ceremony? He asked. At the church, with Mrs. Fenby, the maid, and your mother's woman, in the vestry. And your prayer book? With me. She stopped. A cold line passed through her. My prayer card. Elias's face did not change, but his eyes sharpened. What of it? Winifred reached for the small white prayer book that had been placed beside her bouquet on a side table after the church. Her fingers found the familiar leather cover. She opened it. The page where the pressed myrtle should have rested lay bare. No card, no green sprig, only the faintest dusting of crushed leaf near the binding. It was here, she said. Her voice remained even because something deeper than composure had taken command of her. Before the ceremony, it was here. Lady Althea stepped nearer, gaze lowered in concern. Many things are misplaced on wedding days. Winifred looked from the empty page to the directive. Beneath the dark wax seal, almost hidden by the gloss, lay a faint greenish stain. Myrtle. She saw it, and she knew. She did not yet know who had taken the card, or how the paper had been prepared. But she knew the accusation had touched something stolen from her hands before it reached his. Your Grace, she said to Elias, no longer using his Christian name even in thought. Look beneath the seal. He glanced down. His jaw tightened, but not enough to save her. Dorian spoke before the Duke could. A stain proves nothing. A bride carries flowers. A writing desk may carry flowers. Must we pretend botany is innocence? A few nervous laughs trembled and died. Elias looked at the paper, then at Winifred. He was close enough that she could see the battle inside him. It lasted 1 second, perhaps 2. Then, honor, or what he mistook for honor, won. This matter will not be discussed beyond this room, he said. His voice cut cleanly through every whisper. The Duchess will leave London before nightfall. The Dowager rose 1/2 inch from her chair. Elias. She will reside at Larkmead Priory until I determine what has been done. Winifred's fingers tightened around the prayer book. Until you determine, she repeated. Not until I am heard. His face closed. You have been heard. "No," she said, "I have been answered." The words changed the air. Servants froze at the walls. Dorian looked away first. Lady Althea's lashes lowered, hiding satisfaction, too late for Winifred not to see it. Elias stepped nearer, lowering his voice enough to make the exchange feel private, while every person in the room strained toward it. "If you are innocent, the truth will bear examination." "And if you are wrong," she asked, "what will bear what you have done today?" For the first time, he looked struck, not moved, not softened, struck as if she had placed a hand upon a bruise he had not known he carried. Then the shutters came down again. "The carriage will be prepared." Winifred closed the prayer book. She did not weep. She would not give this room tears to season its gossip. She removed her bridal bouquet from the side table. Not because she wanted it, but because leaving it, there felt like letting them keep the last honest thing she had carried into marriage. The stems trembled once in her grip. A crushed myrtle leaf clung to her glove, green against ivory. Elias saw it. She knew he saw it. Still, he said nothing. Outside, the spring afternoon had turned colder. By the time the travelling carriage rolled from Wetherbourne House, Winifred sat upright with Mrs. Fenby across from her, the prayer book in her lap, the empty place inside it, more accusing than the forged directive had been. London blurred beyond the window in pale stone, iron railings, and faces that would know by dinner that the new Duchess had been sent away. Only when the house disappeared behind them did Winifred open the book again. Her prayer card was gone. Her myrtle was gone. Her husband had chosen the seal over her voice. She pressed one gloved hand flat against the blank page and made herself a promise as the carriage turned toward the northern road. She would not beg to be believed by a man who had found doubt more convenient than trust. But neither would she allow her name to become the instrument that cast widows from their doors. If Larkmead was to be her exile, then Larkmead would also be where the lie began to die. By the 5th morning after leaving London, Winifred had learned that exile did not arrive with thunder. It arrived by degrees in the ache behind the knees, after too many hours in a travelling carriage. In the stiff silence of posting-house parlours where innkeepers bowed to her title, but watched her face, for scandal, in the way Mrs. Fenby pretended not to see the new Duchess open her prayer book each night and stare at the empty place where the ivory card had been. The northern road had stripped the wedding from her piece by piece. Dust dulled the hem of her gown, despite the travelling dress changed at the first inn. Rain spotted the carriage glass through Yorkshire. The air sharpened as they crossed into Northumberland, and by the time Larkmead Priory rose from a fold of grey-green land, Winifred felt less like a bride than a parcel delivered under seal. The house was not ruined, but it looked neglected in the way proud houses did when no one loved them enough to notice their decline. Its old stones had darkened under years of weather. Ivy had climbed beyond discipline around the chapel arch. The gravel before the entrance had not been freshly turned. A narrow bell rope hung beside the door, frayed near the end. When the carriage stopped, no line of servants waited with welcome. Only a thin butler, a housekeeper with cautious eyes, and two maids stood beneath the shallow portico, their faces arranged into obedience rather than warmth. Mrs. Fenby stepped down first, gathering her shawl against the wind. Winifred followed. For one foolish second, her gloved hand moved as if expecting another hand to steady it. Memory came before she could stop it. Elias outside St. George's, his fingers closing over hers with exact care, the brief wait of safety before the silver tray destroyed it. She looked at the glove where his touch had been, then folded her hand into her cloak and let the memory go cold. "Your Grace," the butler said. His bow was correct, but not deep. "I am Mallow, acting butler. Mrs. Crewe is housekeeper." "Thank you, Mallow." Winifred looked from one face to another. "I understand Larkmead has had little notice of my arrival, Mrs." Crewe's mouth tightened. "We had notice enough to prepare your chamber, Your Grace. Notice enough. Not welcome enough." Winifred heard the words beneath the words and inclined her head. "Then I am obliged to you." A maid glanced toward the carriage, perhaps expecting the Duke to appear behind her. No one did. The absence moved through the portico more loudly than wheels on gravel. Inside, Larkmead smelled of cold stone, old wood, and fires lit too late. The entrance hall held portraits whose varnish had browned with age. A table near the stairs carried a cracked blue bowl filled with calling cards so old their edges had curled. No fresh flowers stood anywhere. In London, Wetherbourne House had been arranged to impress the world. Larkmead seemed arranged to endure being forgotten. Mallow led them to a small morning room where tea had been set. The cups were clean, the silver rubbed but thin, the fire uncertain. Winifred removed her gloves slowly, not because she wished to delay, but because everyone watched her hands. A duchess's hands, perhaps, or a culprit's. "I would like the household accounts brought to me after tea," she said. Mrs. Crewe blinked. "The accounts, Your Grace?" "Yes, household, tenant disbursements, repairs ordered within the last year, and any recent steward correspondence." The housekeeper's cautious look sharpened. "His Grace's steward keeps estate matters. Then send for what is kept here. I will not ask twice for papers belonging to a house in which I am expected to reside." The silence that followed was brief, but it held a decision. Mrs. Crewe curtsied. "As Your Grace wishes." When the servants withdrew, Mrs. Fenby sat opposite Winifred and poured tea with hands that had not trembled once during the journey. She was a respectable woman of 50, neither warm nor unkind, with the practical courage of someone who had spent years witnessing grief without trying to decorate it. "You need not begin this hour," Mrs. Fenby said quietly. "You have been 5 days on the road. That is why I must begin this hour." Winifred looked toward the window. Beyond it, a lane curved past the chapel wall and vanished toward the tenant cottages. "If I rest first, they will decide I came here to hide. And if you do not rest, they may decide you came here to command. Then I will have to do neither." Her voice held steady. "I will ask what has been done in my name." The first bundle of accounts arrived before the tea cooled, then a second, then a locked box for which Mrs. Crewe claimed the steward held the key. Winifred did not argue. She began with what was available: coal orders, linen repairs, dairy accounts, wages, roof patching delayed twice, chapel glazing unpaid, and a column of disbursements marked under the North Ridge cottages. The phrase appeared once, then again. Notice acknowledged, removal pending. Her pulse slowed in the dangerous way it had slowed in London. "Mrs. Crewe," she said when the housekeeper returned. "Who delivered warnings to the North Ridge cottages?" Mrs. Crewe looked at the open ledger, then at Mrs. Fenby, then back to Winifred. "The steward's man, Your Grace." "On whose authority?" "It is written there." "That is not an answer." The housekeeper's hands tightened in her apron. "On the authority of the Duchess of Wetherbourne." The title struck the room like thrown glass. Winifred closed the ledger with care. "I have never given such authority." Mrs. Crewe's face changed. Not belief, not yet, but uncertainty. "The tenants were told otherwise." "Then I will hear it from them." Mrs. Fenby rose at once. your grace after the journey." "A widow is marked for removal," Winifred said. "If she has been told I signed away her home, I will not let my fatigue be the first truth she receives from me." The lane to the north ridge was narrow and damp underfoot. Mrs. Fenby accompanied her, with a footman trailing at a proper distance. Word travelled faster than their steps. A child looked from behind a gate and vanished. A man carrying split wood stopped when he saw Winifred's black cloak and ivory bonnet, then touched his cap with a stiffness that was almost resentment. Near the end of the lane stood a cottage with a low thatched roof, a small kitchen garden, and a chalk mark drawn against the dark wood of the door. A cross, simple and pale, removal. Winifred stopped before it. The mark was no larger than her hand, yet it seemed to cover the whole house. The door opened before she knocked. An elderly woman stood within, thin but upright, her white cap tied neatly beneath her chin. Her eyes went first to Winifred's face, then to the footman, then to the carriage road beyond, as if measuring how much power had come to her threshold. "Mrs. Bellwether?" Winifred asked. "Aye, your grace." The words were respectful, the tone was not. "I am told you received notice to leave this cottage." "I was told her grace had better use for the North Ridge." Mrs. Bellwether looked at the chalk mark. "I've lived here 42 years. My husband died in that room. My son's name is cut under the sill from when he was 7, but I suppose stone and memory weigh little beside a duke's bride wanting profit." Mrs. Fenby drew a soft breath. The footman stared hard at the lane. Winifred accepted every word because the woman had been made to believe it. "I did not sign that notice," she said. Mrs. Bellwether's face did not soften. "Begging pardon, your grace. But fine people often don't know what their names do once ink dries." The answer should have offended her. Instead, it steadied her. "Then I must learn," Winifred said. "May I see?" Woman hesitated. "You won't take it. Not unless you permit me to copy it. It belongs to you until we know who sent it." That, more than denial, reached her. Mrs. Bellwether stepped aside and returned with a folded paper, worn soft at the creases. Winifred read it beneath the cottage eaves. The language was cold, formal, and false. Her married title appeared in full: Winifred Deverick, Duchess of Wetherbourne. A date sat at the top, the morning of her wedding, before she had left St. George's, before any lawful order could have been drafted by her hand from Wetherbourne House. The impossibility was small enough for a careless man to miss and large enough to hang a liar. She looked at the signature mark, then at the page. "Mrs. Bellwether, who delivered this, Mr. Pike, clerk to the steward's solicitor," so he said. Winifred folded the notice along its old creases and handed it back. "Thank you. I will ask to copy this tomorrow, with you present, and I will not remove it from your keeping." The widow studied her. "Why would you trouble yourself if His Grace sent you here to be rid of you?" The question was not cruel. It was worse. It was honest. Winifred felt the road behind her, the empty prayer book in her chamber, the silver tray, Elias's eyes choosing paper over her voice. She lifted her chin. "Because I know what it is to have a mark placed upon one's door before one has been heard." Mrs. Bellwether looked at the chalk cross. Then, slowly, she looked back at Winifred. Nothing like trust passed between them. Not yet. But the old woman did not close the door. At Larkmead, that was the first mercy. That evening, by candlelight, Winifred copied the date from memory into her own small notebook, then opened the prayer book once more. The empty page waited. She touched the place in her glove where Elias had steadied her after the chapel, then drew her hand away and folded the glove into the drawer as one might fold away a letter, never answered. Whatever kindness had flickered that morning had not survived the first accusation. Very well. She would not build her courage upon it. On the desk before her lay the household ledger, the copied names of threatened tenants, and one fact sharp enough to cut through grief. The notices bore her married title before she had ever used it. Somewhere between London and Larkmead, someone had needed her name to become a weapon quickly. Winifred dipped her pen, wrote Mrs. Bellwether at the top of a clean page, and beneath it, in a firmer hand, began a list of every door she meant to save. The directive remained on Elias Deverick's desk long after every servant in Wetherbourne House had learned to walk more softly past the library door. London had resumed its polished habits with indecent speed. Carriages rolled through Mayfair. Calling cards appeared on silver salvers. Ladies who had stood beneath his chandeliers at the wedding breakfast sent notes written in ink so delicate that malice almost looked like sympathy. His Grace must be suffering. The poor bride must be overwhelmed by station. Such a pity when ambition outruns breeding. Elias read none of them twice. He had ordered silence, and society had obeyed only in the manner society always obeyed power. It had lowered its voice. That was not the same as mercy. On the third evening after Winifred's departure, rain tapped against the library windows, while the Duke sat alone with the paper that had ruined his marriage before it had begun. A branch of candles burned low beside him. The false directive lay flat beneath a paperweight, its black seal catching the light like a hardened wound. He had already read it too often, to the steward at Larkmead Priory. By authority of Her Grace, Winifred Deverick, Duchess of Wetherbourne, the North Ridge cottages to be cleared by Michaelmas in anticipation of private mineral negotiation under Sir Dorian Aveling's direction. The phrasing was cold, efficient, damning. It had seemed damning enough in the breakfast room, with relatives breathing judgment around him and Winifred standing so still that her stillness had looked like guilt to a man already afraid of being made a fool. Now in the library, without witnesses to satisfy and without pride to feed, one detail would not remain obedient. The date. It sat at the top of the page, neat and fatal. The morning of the wedding. The hour noted beneath it was 11:30. Elias read it once. Then again, at 11:30, Winifred Aveling had been in St. George's, Hanover Square, standing beside him before the altar. He remembered the line of her veil. He remembered the small lift of her chin when the clergyman asked if she would take him. He remembered, with sudden and unwelcome clarity, that she had answered without hesitation. She had not sounded like a woman preparing to evict widows. She had sounded like a woman stepping into a difficult life, with courage enough to make it honest. Elias pushed back his chair and stood. The movement sent the nearest candle flame leaning. He walked to the hearth, then back again. A Deverick did not indulge doubt once judgment had been given. His father had taught him that. His grandfather had carved it into the family like a commandment. Hesitation was weakness. Public correction was humiliation. A duke protected the house first, then sorted gentler questions later. But Winifred's voice returned to him with merciless calm. "No, I have been answered." He closed his hand around the edge of the desk until the carved wood pressed into his palm. There had been no tears in her when he sent her away. That should have made the act easier to defend. Instead, it condemned him more thoroughly. A liar might have wept for effect. Winifred had preserved dignity because it was the only possession he had not yet taken from her. A knock sounded. "Enter." His valet, Hartley, opened the door with a bow. He was a narrow man of careful habits, old enough to know when silence was service and when silence became cowardice. "You sent for me, Your Grace." "I did." Elias lifted the directive. "On the morning of my wedding, who had access to the antechamber beside the breakfast room before the guests were admitted." Hartley's face did not change, but his fingers tightened once around the folded linen he carried. "Several servants, Your Grace." Mrs. Vale arranged the gift table. 2 footmen carried wine. Lady Marstow stepped in briefly. Elias looked up. "Lady Althea?" "Yes, Your Grace. Why was I not told?" Hartley's gaze lowered. At the time, there seemed nothing remarkable in it. She said she had misplaced a glove and did not wish to trouble the bride. The bride, not the Duchess, not Winifred, the bride who had then lost a prayer card from a book left near that very antechamber. Elias set down the directive with care. "Did she touch the wedding gifts?" "I cannot say." Hartley hesitated, "but I saw her near the side table where her Grace's bouquet and prayer book had been placed after the church." The silence after that was not empty. It was alive. Elias saw again the breakfast room. Winifred opening the little prayer book, her face altering by the smallest degree when she found the card gone. He had noticed, and still he had chosen the paper. "Send for Mr. Aldrin," he said. "At once, Your Grace." At once. The family solicitor arrived within the hour, damp at the shoulders, spectacles fogged from the rain, and expression sharpened by the lateness of the summons. Mr. Aldrin had served the Deverick estates for 20 years, and had never mistaken aristocratic urgency for legal clarity. Elias respected him for that, although at present the man's restraint irritated him. "I need the Larkmead mineral correspondence," Elias said without greeting. "Any letter received from Sir Dorian Aveling in the last 6 months. Any inquiry, draft, prospect, or informal note." Aldrin removed a packet from his case. "I anticipated Your Grace might ask." Elias's eyes lifted. "Why?" "Because Sir Dorian has been asking questions he has no standing to ask." The solicitor placed 3 letters on the desk. "He approached my clerk twice regarding Northern Ridge rights. I instructed the office not to answer without your authority. Your clerk, a temporary clerk, Mr. Reuben Pike." Elias went very still. "Was Pike present at Wetherbourne House on the day of my wedding?" "He was sent with settlement copies to be checked by Sir Dorian's man of business. He should not have remained beyond noon." Elias picked up the directive. "This paper stock." Aldrin touched the edge, then frowned. "Not from your household office. It resembles what we use for rough estate drafts. And the seal?" The solicitor bent closer. Black wax, hard and glossy, bore the impression of a plain authority mark. Crude enough to seem hurried, but formal enough to frighten a steward. At the lower rim of the wax, almost swallowed by darkness, lay the faint greenish stain Winifred had seen before any of them. Aldrin's expression changed. "That is not ordinary residue." Elias opened the drawer where he had placed the small ivory card found folded behind the directive in the original packet. At the wedding breakfast, he had thought it merely some devotional scrap caught with the document. He had not connected it to her prayer book. He had not wanted connection. Now he laid it beneath the candles. The card was not large, no longer than his hand. A line of prayer was printed in soft black type. The lower corner carried a flattened mark where a sprig had rested. Myrtle, perhaps. The same green stain crossed one edge, and near its center was a shallow pressure mark, as if warm wax had once been pressed above it through another paper. Elias stared at it. A small object, stolen from a bride's book, had sat in his evidence packet while he accused her of cruelty. He had carried the proof of violence against her voice and had called it judgment. Aldrin removed his spectacles, cleaned them, and put them back on. Your Grace, if this card belonged to Her Grace before the ceremony, and if the directive was sealed against or atop it, then paper was prepared by someone with access to her belongings. Not by her. The words came before caution. They sounded less like conclusion than confession. Not at the hour written. That would appear difficult, Your Grace. Difficult. The lawyer's word for impossible when Rank was in the room. Elias turned toward the window. Rain blurred his reflection until he looked like a stranger trapped behind glass. Behind him lay the directive, the prayer card, the letters from Dorian, the name Reuben Pike, and the ghost of Winifred standing in ivory silk while he mistook composure for deceit. He thought of Larkmead Priory, cold and distant. He had sent her there among tenants already primed to hate her. He had called it inquiry. In truth, he had made her live inside the accusation. No one, he said, still facing the rain, is to speak against the Duchess in this house or any Deverick house. Any servant who repeats gossip leaves my service. Any relation who does so loses my door. Hartley bowed from near the wall. Aldrin nodded once. I will draft the instruction. Draft more than that. Elias turned. Letters to Larkmead, Mrs. Crewe, the acting steward, and the parish rector if needed. Her Grace is to be obeyed in all household matters. No tenant is to be removed. No notice is to be acted upon until I arrive. Aldrin's pen paused over his notebook. You intend to go north? Elias looked at the ivory prayer card. He remembered her hand in his outside the church. The brief trust of her weight when he steadied her. He had thought it nothing at the time, now that one breath of contact seemed to accuse him more tenderly than any word she had spoken. I intend, he said, to find out who made a liar of my wife. Hartley looked up at that, my wife. Elias heard it too. Not Duchess, not problem, not scandal, wife. The word stood in the library like something living, fragile, and already wounded by his hand. He picked up the prayer card and placed it inside his breast pocket. Not as sentiment, he told himself, but because evidence belonged with the man responsible for pursuing it. Yet when the card settled against his coat, close to the place where his heart struck too hard against his ribs, he did not move it away. Have the travelling carriage prepared, he said, before dawn. Aldrin gathered the letters. The roads north will be poor after this rain. Elias looked once more at the date on the directive, 11:30, the hour when she had stood beside him and given him her name. Then, the roads may judge me as they please. By morning, the first Deverick orders would ride ahead of him. By morning, London would learn that the Duke of Wetherbourne had left for the north in haste. But in the hour before dawn, alone in the library, Elias took the directive from beneath the paperweight and read the date one final time. Then he closed his eyes and saw Winifred's face when she had asked what would bear what he had done. For the first time in his life, the Duke had no answer worthy of his title. The first change of horses took place before London had properly woken, and Elias watched the city fall behind him, with the ivory prayer card resting inside his coat like a rebuke that had learned to breathe. Dawn lay thin over the northern road. Rain had left the paving slick, and the travelling carriage lurched past market carts, milkmaids, and yawning ostlers, while the Duke of Wetherbourne sat opposite, a leather case filled with documents that no longer felt like evidence alone. They felt like accusations against himself. The false directive lay wrapped in oilcloth. Beside it were Sir Dorian Aveling's letters concerning Larkmead's mineral prospects, Mr. Aldrin's notes about Reuben Pike, and the small card stolen from Winifred's prayer book. Elias had ordered fresh horses at every possible stage, but rank could not command mud to dry or ruts to mend. The road north accepted his urgency without interest. At Hatfield, the ostler knew nothing. At Stamford, a sleepy posting-house clerk remembered a man matching Pike's description, because the fellow had complained about the cost of better horses, while insisting he must outrun a family misunderstanding. At Grantham, Elias stepped from the carriage into a yard smelling of wet straw and asked the question himself, though Hartley had begged to do it for him. "Black sealing wax," Elias said, placing a folded note from Mr. Aldrin on the counter. "Estate paper of this stock. Who purchased it last week?" The innkeeper, faced with a duke whose coat still bore rain at the shoulders, forgot to be evasive. "A clerkish gentleman, your grace. Thin face, nervous hands, paid in coin, not account. Asked whether northbound post could be had without delay. His name? Didn't give one, your grace, but he had a packet marked for Larkmead." Larkmead. The word tightened in Elias's chest. He thanked the man, paid too generously, and returned to the carriage. As the wheels caught the road again, he drew the prayer card from his pocket. He had told himself he carried it because it was material proof. That was still true. Yet somewhere between the third inn and the fourth, the card had become more than a clue. The faint myrtle stain, at the edge, the shallow wax pressure near the printed prayer, the delicacy of the thing itself, all spoke of a private bride who had brought one small sacred object into a marriage arranged by others. Someone had stolen it. He had used its theft to condemn her. He pressed the card between both hands, careful not to bend it. At St. George's, she had stood beside him and promised what the ceremony required. He could not remember the exact words of the clergyman now. He remembered only her hand, brief and steady beneath his, when he helped her into the carriage. He had noticed her then, not as Evelyn's sister, not as a settlement, as a woman with enough courage to walk into an uncertain life, without asking the room to pity her. The memory had followed him more faithfully than pride. By the time the carriage crossed into colder country, he had drafted 3 instructions in his own hand. The first forbade any tenant removal at Larkmead. The second ordered Mrs. Crewe and every servant of the priory to obey her grace in household matters. The third, shorter than the others, took him longest to write. No person under Deverick authority is to treat the Duchess as prisoner, culprit, or guest on sufferance. She is mistress of Larkmead Priory until I arrive. He sanded the paper, sealed it, and gave it to a mounted messenger at the next posting stop. "Ride ahead," he said. "Change horses if you must. Her Grace receives this before any steward, clerk, or Aveling man touches another paper." The rider bowed and was gone into the wet road. Elias watched him disappear, then looked down at the black wax cooling on his own seal. A seal had ruined her. A seal must not be the only thing he sent in repair. Far ahead of him, at Larkmead Priory, Winifred stood in the housekeeper's room, with a list of cottage names in her hand and 3 servants waiting, as if the words she spoke might change the weather. The morning after her visit to Mrs. Bellwether, she had requested copies of every notice held on the estate. Requested was the polite word. In truth, she had gone from cupboard to cupboard, ledger to ledger, refusing to be diverted by Mrs. Crewe's anxious insistence that the steward's authority was separate from household management. "If the notices were delivered in my name," Winifred said, "then they are now my concern." Mrs. Crewe looked older than she had at the door. "Your Grace, the tenants will think you are gathering papers to make the removals final. Then they must see what I do with them. And what will your Grace do?" Winifred looked at the list again. Mrs. Bellwether, Thomas Cale and his wife, the Morton sisters, old Mr. Venn, who had lost a son in naval service and kept bees behind his cottage, 6 homes, 6 lives made vulnerable by ink. I will learn every name before anyone dares call them entries. The housekeeper's eyes flickered, perhaps from surprise, perhaps from shame. Before she could answer, hurried steps sounded beyond the passage. Mallow appeared with a sealed paper in his hand and discomfort in every line of his narrow body. A messenger from his Grace. The room changed at once. A maid straightened. Mrs. Crewe's fingers went to her keys. Mrs. Fenby, seated near the window with her sewing untouched in her lap, looked at Winifred first, not the seal. Winifred accepted the paper. For one foolish, furious instant, her heart moved before her reason could stop it. Elias had written. Then she saw herself as she must have looked, waiting for words from the man who had sent her away, and the foolishness hardened into discipline. She broke the seal. The instruction was not apology. It did not ask forgiveness. It did not explain. But line by line, it altered the room beneath her feet. No tenant was to be removed. No notice was to be acted upon. Her authority at Larkmead was to be recognized in full. No servant was to treat her as prisoner, culprit, or guest on sufferance. She read it once in silence. Then she looked at Mallow, Mrs. Crewe, the maids, and the footman lingering in the hall. "You will all hear this clearly," she said. Her voice did not tremble. "His Grace has ordered that no tenant is to be removed under any notice now in circulation. Until he arrives, household authority rests with me." Mallow bowed more deeply than he had upon her arrival. Mrs. Crewe lowered her head. Something like relief moved through the younger maid's face before she could hide it. Winifred folded the letter. It had protected her position, but it had not touched the wound beneath it. She would not mistake function for repentance. Still, power in a household was not nothing when frightened people were watching to see which way safety leaned. "Mrs. Crewe," she said, "send word to Mrs. Bellwether that the chalk mark on her door is to be washed away by noon. Not scraped in secret, washed openly." The housekeeper curtsied. "Yes, Your Grace." Winifred turned back to the ledger. "And bring me the tithe barn key." A shadow crossed Mrs. Crewe's face. "The tithe barn accounts are steward's records." "So I have been told. They are old, Your Grace, confused, not fit for immediate reading. Few lies are fit for daylight, Mrs. Crewe. That does not excuse leaving them in the dark." Before the housekeeper could answer, another visitor was announced without the dignity of proper delay. Mr. Reuben Pike had arrived from the South Road in a hired post-chaise, damp, narrow-faced, and too quick with his bow. He entered the morning room with a leather satchel clutched beneath his arm and eyes that went first to the papers on the desk. "Your Grace," he said, bending low, "I come under urgent instruction regarding certain mistaken notices." "From whom?" Winifred asked. "His Grace is aware of everything." "That is not an answer." Pike's smile twitched. "The Duke wishes the matter handled quietly. If Your Grace will place the notices in my keeping, I can prevent unnecessary distress among the tenants." Mrs. Fenby's sewing stilled. Mallow looked toward Winifred, awaiting command. Winifred rested one hand over the list of names. "How compassionate of you to protect the tenants from the sight of papers already nailed to their doors." Pike swallowed. Public alarm serves no one. Truth often alarms those who mislaid it. His fingers tightened on the satchel. Your Grace is newly arrived. Estate matters can appear harsher than they are. Widows losing cottages are seldom comforted by appearances. She lifted one of the copied notices. This paper bears my married title before I had used it. You delivered at least one notice to Mrs. Bellwether. Did you draft it as well? I carried what I was instructed to carry. By whom? The steward's office. Name the hand. He did not. In that pause, Winifred learned more than an answer might have taught her. Pike looked again at the desk, at the folded ducal instruction, at the list she had made. Fear moved across his face, small and sharp. Then he bowed. I see your Grace is resolved. I shall return when his Grace can clarify matters. You will return when summoned, Winifred said, and you will not approach any tenant door before then. His eyes flashed with resentment, but the Duke's fresh order lay visible beside her hand. For now, that was enough to make him bow and retreat. Through the window, Winifred watched his post-chaise turn back toward the lower road rather than the village, not defeated. Warning someone. Mrs. Fenby came to stand beside her. He will not let the matter rest. No, Winifred said. He came to retrieve the papers before the Duke arrived. The words cost her more than she expected. The Duke, Elias, coming north. Somewhere on the road between pride and truth, he was moving toward her. She looked down at the folded instruction, then away from it. The letter had given her authority. It had not given back the moment when he should have believed her, without a date, a stain, or a seal, to force him. Your Grace, Mallow said carefully from the doorway. Shall I still bring the tithe barn key? Winifred turned from the window. Outside, beyond the wet lawns and chapel wall, 6 cottages waited beneath a sky the color of pewter. Yes, she said, and send for more candles, if Mr. Pike fears those accounts being opened. Then we shall begin before supper. The tithe barn key was colder than it looked, and when Mrs. Crewe placed it in Winifred's palm, the iron seemed to carry every year of silence that Larkmead had stored behind a locked door. By late afternoon, the sky had lowered over the priory in a sheet of dull pewter, and the old barn beyond the chapel wall stood with its broad doors barred against wind and neglect. It had once received grain, wool, rents, disputes, promises, and grievances. Now ivy crawled around its stone corners, and rainwater had darkened the threshold where tenants must once have waited, with caps in hand, while stewards decided whether mercy could be entered into an account. Winifred stood before it, with Mrs. Fenby at her side, Mallow holding a lantern behind them, and Mrs. Crewe clutching a ring of lesser keys, as if everyone might accuse her of obedience to the wrong master. Your Grace, the housekeeper said, her voice low. These records have long been under the steward's keeping. I don't know what state they're in. Then we shall learn together. Winifred slid the key into the lock. It resisted. For a moment, she thought the mechanism had rusted beyond use. But then the bolt gave with a reluctant scrape that startled a bird from the eaves. The door opened on the smell of dust, old straw, damp wood, and paper left too long without honest handling. Mallow lifted the lantern. Shelves lined the inner wall, stacked with leather-bound ledgers, tied bundles of receipts, and wooden boxes marked by year. A long table stood at the center, its surface scarred by knives, ink, and candle burns. Winifred entered first. She did not know why the small act mattered until she had done it. If the tenants had been threatened in her name, she would not stand at the threshold and allow others to bring truth to her like a tray. The North Ridge records, she said. Mrs. Crewe pointed toward a lower shelf. Those, I believe. Mallow set 2 boxes upon the table. Dust rose, silver in the lantern light. Mrs. Fenby opened her sewing scissors and cut the first tape when the knot would not loosen. The sound was small but decisive. For the next hour, paper made the only language in the barn. Pages turned, receipts were sorted, names appeared, faded, repeated, crossed through by death or marriage. Mrs. Bellwether's husband had once paid 3 shillings in arrears after a failed harvest, forgiven by order of the late Duchess. Thomas Cale had repaired a boundary wall in exchange for half a quarter's rent. The Morton sisters had supplied linen to the Priory stillroom. These were not entries, they were lives pressed flat by ink, waiting for someone to read them as human again. Winifred copied each threatened household into her notebook. Her hand ached, but she did not pause. The list grew. Bellwether, Cale Morton, Venn Pritchard, Elwick. Beside each, she marked what the ledgers said before the recent notices had begun. Long occupancy, customary renewals, repairs accepted in lieu of rent. No lawful removal noted. There, Mrs. Fenby said suddenly. She tapped one page with the tip of the scissors. That hand changes. Winifred leaned closer. The earlier entries had been written in a broad, old-fashioned script, brown with age. Halfway down the page, the ink darkened. The letters narrowed. The word cleared appeared beside 3 cottages, then 4. After Duchess's order, after Duchess's order, after Duchess's order. Winifred felt the phrase move through her like a cold draught. I gave no order. No one contradicted her. That silence was new. Mrs. Crewe's face had gone pale. Those lines were not there last quarter, she whispered. Winifred looked at her. You are certain? I checked coal allotments before Christmas. Mrs. Bellwether's cottage was marked for roof patching, not clearing. Why did you not say so when the notices arrived? Shame tightened the older woman's mouth. Because Mr. Pike said the new arrangements came from London. Because Sir Dorian's man had been asking after the ridge. Because his grace had not yet brought a duchess here, and when the notice bore your title. She stopped. Because I was afraid to know more than I was told. Winifred accepted the answer. It was not noble, but it was true. Fear had many servants. Some wore livery, some kept keys. She turned the next page. A thin line of torn paper remained near the binding. One page had been cut out with a sharp blade. Beneath it, on the following sheet, faint pressure marks crossed the paper where someone had written hard upon the missing page. Winifred lowered the lantern until the shadow caught the indentations. Not enough to read fully. Enough to see repeated words, consent, witness, Duchess. Mrs. Fenby, she said, the graphite from my writing case. Mrs. Fenby was already opening it, with the care of a woman dusting soot from a child's cheek. Winifred passed the graphite lightly over a small section of the page. The pressure marks darkened. A phrase emerged in ghostly fragments. No removal without witnessed consent of her grace after solemnization. Mrs. Crewe crossed herself before she could remember that a housekeeper in a ducal barn ought not show fear so plainly. Mallow whispered, Then the notices are against the old clause. They are against the clause someone removed, Winifred said. She stared at the torn stub, and they needed the tenants to believe I had given consent after marriage. But the notice was dated before you came from the church, Mrs. Fenby said. Yes. Winifred looked at the altered entries again. That is why they needed speed. If the lie reached Larkmead before I did, fear would do half the work. The barn door groaned under a sudden gust. Rain rattled against the roof. For an instant, Winifred saw the whole cruel design. The silver tray in London, the missing prayer card, the false authority of a new title, the chalk mark on Mrs. Bellwether's door. Elias had been the hand that sent her away, but someone else had placed the road beneath her feet. That did not absolve him. It did not need to. Truth was not a kindness arranged for his comfort. "We will copy every altered entry," she said. "Every name, every date, every word we can raise from these pressure marks." Mrs. Crewe looked toward the door. "If the tenants are summoned, Your Grace, some may come angry. They have cause to be angry. At you? Then I will stand where they can see me, Mrs." Fenby's eyes softened, though her voice remained practical. "You risk being shouted down before His Grace arrives." Winifred dipped her pen into the portable ink pot. Mallow had fetched and wrote Mrs. Bellwether's name again, this time beside the phrase roof patching, not clearing. "If I wait for His Grace, they will think truth must arrive in a duke's carriage before it has weight." Mallow shifted. "There are men on the ridge who won't like hearing that the papers are false. Men who have been frightened for days can sound rougher than they mean. Then we shall give them something steadier than rumor." She turned to Mrs. Crewe. "Post a notice for rent day at the tithe barn. All affected tenants are to attend if they wish. They may bring their notices. They may bring witnesses. They may ask me directly whether I signed away their homes." Mrs. Crewe swallowed. "And what shall the notice say?" Winifred considered the question. Not a defense, not a plea, not the soft language of aristocratic evasion. "It shall say that the Duchess of Wetherbourne will answer for every paper bearing her name." The words settled over the table. Mrs. Fenby watched her for a moment. "That is a dangerous sentence. So is silence." Mallow bowed, and this time there was no reluctance in it. "I'll see it posted, Your Grace." When he left, the barn seemed larger, darker, more awake. Winifred worked until the lantern flame burned low and the copied names filled 2 pages. Her fingers had cramped by the end. A smear of ink marked the side of her hand. She thought of Elias somewhere on the northern road. If, indeed, he was still coming. Perhaps with apologies rehearsed in the privacy of a carriage. Some fragile, unwanted part of her wished to see his face when he learned that the lie had roots deeper than a single forged directive. Some even more foolish part wished he would arrive before the tenants looked at her with hatred. She despised that wish as soon as it formed. Wanting help from the man who had wounded her did not make her weak. Depending upon it would. She closed the ledger and placed her copied list inside her notebook. "These will remain with me tonight," she said. "The ledger stays here, locked. The missing page must be found, but no one is to search alone." Mrs. Crewe nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." As they stepped back into the wet evening, a figure moved near the lower yard wall, too far for clear recognition. Thin, hat pulled low, then gone toward the road. Mallow lifted the lantern, but the rain swallowed the shape. Mrs. Fenby drew closer. "Mr. Pike?" "Perhaps." Winifred looked toward the village, where 6 cottages waited under their thatched roofs, each one carrying more truth than the paper that threatened it. Or perhaps whoever Mr. Pike serves. That night the notice was posted beside the chapel gate and at the lane to the north ridge. By morning, every tenant would know. By rent day, they would come with fear, anger, and folded papers, worn soft from being read in the dark. Winifred stood at her chamber window long after the house had quieted, watching rain bead upon the glass. On the desk behind her lay the copied names, not accounts, not entries, names. The lie had made them a weapon against her. She would make them witnesses. Elias arrived at Larkmead Priory with mud on his boots, rain on his coat, and the expression of a man who had discovered that a road could be crossed more quickly than a wrong could be repaired. The traveling carriage came up the lane just after noon, its wheels grinding over wet gravel while the priory windows caught a hard gleam of pale spring light. Mallow saw it first from the hall and went so still that Mrs. Crewe nearly walked into him with a tray of folded linen. Within moments the house knew. Doors opened. A maid ran toward the kitchen. Mrs. Fenby looked up from Winifred's copied tenant list and said nothing, which was kinder than asking whether her Grace wished to receive her husband. Winifred had been in the chapel yard when the carriage sounded, comparing the myrtle dust left in her prayer book with the faint green stain she had sketched from memory beneath the false seal. She had gone there because the chapel was the last place at Larkmead that did not seem to expect an answer from her. Its stone path was uneven, bordered by rain-dark earth and a tangle of old myrtle grown woody with neglect. Her prayer book lay open in her hand. The empty page still carried a trace where the missing card had once rested. She heard the carriage, then the abrupt silence after it stopped. A moment later, footsteps crossed the gravel behind her, not hurried, not ceremonial, heavy with fatigue. She did not turn at once. She looked down at the page, at the crushed ghost of myrtle near the binding, and told herself that a man could travel 5 days and still arrive too late. "Your Grace, Mrs." Fenby said softly from near the chapel gate. Winifred closed the prayer book. Only then did she turn. Elias stood a few yards away, hat in hand, his dark hair damp from the road, his coat splashed, his face more drawn than she remembered. London had made him severe. Travel had made him human. That was the first unkind thought that came to her. And because it hurt, she knew some foolish part of her had been waiting to see whether he would look ashamed. He did. Not elegantly, not in a manner suited to drawing rooms. Shame had stripped something from him. He bowed, and it was not the shallow inclination a duke gave a wife already under his power. It was lower, Winifred. Her name in his voice struck more deeply than his title ever had. She held the prayer book against her middle. "Your Grace." He flinched almost imperceptibly, which told her he had heard the distance. Good, let him hear it. Let him stand in what he had made. "I was wrong," he said. No greeting, no explanation placed before apology. Only that. The chapel bell rope shifted in the wind above them. Mrs. Fenby remained near the gate, close enough for propriety, far enough to leave words room to wound. Winifred looked at the man before her and thought of the silver tray, the silence, the carriage north, Mrs. Bellwether's chalk-marked door. "No, Your Grace," she said. "You were powerful, and you were wrong." The words landed between them with the soundless force of a door opening onto a locked room. Elias lowered his eyes. Yes, she had not expected agreement. Anger had prepared itself for defense. It did not know what to do with yes. "I believed a paper because it was easier than believing a woman whose character I had not taken the trouble to know." His hand moved toward his coat, then stopped. "May I show you something? If it is another document condemning me, I have had practice." Pain crossed his face. He accepted the blow without protest and drew out a small packet wrapped in oilcloth. From it, with more care than she had seen him use with the directive in London, he removed the ivory bridal prayer card. The breath left Winifred so quietly that only she felt the loss. It was there, not whole in the way memory had kept it. Wax had stained one edge. A shallow pressure mark crossed the printed prayer. The place where the myrtle sprig had rested remained faintly green. She did not step forward. Her hands tightened around the prayer book. "Where did you get that?" "It was folded behind the directive when it came to me in London. I thought it incidental." His mouth tightened. I thought many things that were convenient to my pride. It was in my prayer book before the ceremony. I know that now. He held it so she could see without requiring her to take it from him. The directive was dated while you were at the altar. The wax bears this stain. Hartley saw Lady Althea near the side table where your prayer book and bouquet had been placed. Mr. Aldrin confirmed. Sir Dorian had been asking after Larkmead mineral leases through a clerk named Reuben Pike. The names moved through her without surprise and yet with impact. Althea, graceful beside the wedding gifts. Dorian, smiling over his glass pikes, asking too quickly for notices. The pattern sharpened, but not completely. She still lacked proof of hands, sequence, motive strong enough to stand before tenants. You have learned much, she said, after it was useful to me. Yes. Again that terrible yes. He looked at the card, then back to her. I sent you here among people prepared to fear you. I called it inquiry. It was punishment. It was exile. Yes, wind stirred the chapel ivy. Somewhere beyond the wall, a cart moved along the lane, its wheels slow in mud. Winifred wanted to remain entirely cold. She wanted the sight of him to mean nothing beyond the arrival of a man with evidence. But the prayer card trembled once between his fingers, and she saw that his hand was not steady, not from weakness, from restraint, from the effort not to reach for forgiveness he had not earned. Mrs. Bellwether's door was marked, she said. There are notices in my name. The ledgers in the tithe barn have been altered. A page was cut out, but the pressure marks remain. They speak of consent required after marriage. Elias closed his eyes briefly, as if each fact were another mile he had not travelled in time. No tenant will be removed. That is not yours alone to declare now. Not if my name was used to frighten them. His eyes opened. Then tell me what must be done. They must hear it publicly, from evidence, from me, not merely from the Duke, who first condemned me and now changes his mind. The words could have humiliated him. Perhaps they did. He did not hide from them. Then I will stand where you require me to stand. It was too soon for trust, but not too soon to notice when command had learned to lower its voice. The chapel step beneath Winifred's shoe was slick with rain. She shifted, and the edge of her boot slipped against moss-dark stone. Elias moved at once, then stopped himself so sharply the restraint was visible. His hand opened, palm upward, not touching her. May I? The simplicity of it unsettled her more than apology. In London, he had sent her away with an order. Here, before one wet chapel step, he asked. Mrs. Fenby's gaze rested tactfully on the myrtle hedge. Winifred looked at his offered hand. The memory of St. George's came back, his gloved fingers steadying hers before everything broke. This was not that moment repeated. It could not be new innocence. But it could be a first correction. She placed her hand lightly in his. His fingers closed only enough to support, no more. Warmth passed through the glove, brief and controlled. He helped her down one step to the level path. When her footing steadied, he released her before she withdrew. That mattered. She hated that it mattered. Thank you, she said, because courtesy was not surrender. I have not earned thanks. No, she replied. You have earned the right not to see me fall on wet stone. Do not enlarge it. A rough sound might almost have been laughter if sorrow had not broken it first. I won't. The contraction made him sound less like a duke and more like a man who had not slept. She turned toward the priory. Servants had gathered discreetly beneath the portico, trying and failing not to watch. Elias saw them. His face changed, not hardening this time, but settling into public responsibility. He walked beside Winifred, not before her, across the wet grass to the entrance. Mallow bowed deeply. Mrs. Crewe curtsied with visible anxiety. The younger maids dipped so low their caps shook. Elias stopped on the threshold and spoke clearly enough for every listening servant to hear. Her Grace is Duchess of Wetherbourne in full authority. She is mistress of this house. No person in my service will treat her as prisoner, culprit, or guest on sufferance. Any order bearing her name is to be brought to her directly. Any tenant notice is suspended until she has examined it. If there is confusion, you will presume her authority before you presume any paper. The words moved across the portico like weather breaking. Mrs. Crewe bowed again, deeper than before. Mallow's shoulders loosened. Winifred felt the household's fear shift, not vanish. Fear never vanished because a duke spoke. But it had been forced to change direction. Elias looked at her then, not seeking praise, not asking whether he had done well. Was that correct? He asked quietly. She measured him for one long second. It was necessary. That is not the same. No. Before either could say more, wheels sounded from the lower lane. A neat barouche approached through the damp, its panels dark green, its driver liveried, its occupant seated beneath a trimmed travelling bonnet, as if rain itself had been instructed not to touch her. Lady Althea Marstow smiled before the carriage had fully stopped. "My dear Winifred," she called, voice sweet enough to sour the air. "I came the moment I heard how lonely you must be." Her gaze moved to Elias, then to the prayer card still in his hand. The smile remained, only her eyes changed. For the first time since London, Winifred saw fear touch the woman who had watched her disgrace. Elias saw it too. The card lay between them, ivory against his road-dark glove, no longer merely stolen, no longer merely lost. It had become a witness. By rent day, the tithe barn no longer looked like a storehouse for old grain and older silence. It looked like a place where judgment had been invited indoors. Mallow had swept the central floor before dawn, but the boards still held the dark stains of years, and the smell of damp straw lingered beneath the sharper scents of candle wax, wet wool, and fear. A long table stood near the far wall with the copied names placed in order, not hidden, not softened, not guarded behind ducal authority. Winifred had insisted on that. If the tenants were to come with papers that had frightened them in the night, she would not answer from behind a screen of rank. She stood beside the table in a dark blue gown, plain enough for work and proper enough for station, her prayer book closed at her side, her missing card not present because Elias still held it as evidence. Mrs. Fenby waited near the vestry door. Mrs. Crewe and Mallow stood with the household staff. Elias stood 3 paces to Winifred's right, close enough that if the anger in the room turned unsafe, everyone would know the Duke could intervene, but far enough that his shadow did not cover her. That distance was not accident. She had chosen it. He had accepted it. The tenants entered in 2s and 3s, hats in hand, shoulders damp from the morning mist. Mrs. Bellwether came first, upright, despite the hesitation of the younger woman supporting her elbow. Thomas Cale followed with his wife, her face pale above a patched shawl. The Morton sisters came together, one clutching a folded notice so tightly the paper had softened at the edges. Old Mr. Venn stood near the door, as if he trusted thresholds more than tables. Their eyes moved from Winifred to Elias, then back to Winifred again. Fear had taught them to look for the person with power. Anger taught them to look at the person whose name had appeared on the threat. Lady Althea Marstow arrived last, with a companion she had likely brought for propriety, and an expression arranged in compassionate distress. She wore pale grey, not mourning, but close enough to borrow its dignity. Behind her came Reuben Pike, nervous beneath a respectable coat, carrying a leather folder as if paper could shield him from consequence. Winifred looked once at Elias. His face had gone still, but not cold. "The room is yours," he said quietly. "Only if you remember that," she replied. His eyes lowered in acknowledgement. She turned to the tenants. "You were summoned because notices have been delivered in my name. You have the right to hear me answer them in the same place where Larkmead records are kept." A murmur moved through the barn. Mrs. Bellwether stepped forward. "Did you sign them, Your Grace?" No accusation could have been cleaner. Winifred respected her for it. "No." Thomas Cale's jaw tightened. "Begging Your Grace's pardon. But that is what great houses say when little houses are already marked." Elias moved half an inch. Winifred did not look at him, but she felt the restraint it cost him to stop. "Then do not take my word," she said. "Bring the paper." Mrs. Bellwether laid hers down first. Others followed, folded notices placed along the table like small white doors. Pike stepped forward quickly. "Your Grace, perhaps it would be better if I arranged the documents. The tenants are distressed, and there is no need to expose them to confusion." "They have already been exposed to eviction," Winifred said. "Confusion is gentler." A faint sound passed among the tenants. Not laughter, recognition. Pike flushed and withdrew. Lady Althea tilted her head with sorrowful grace. "My dear Winifred, no one doubts that this has been distressing. But perhaps your eagerness to manage estate concerns so soon after marriage created an unfortunate impression. Ambition is often misunderstood in a young duchess." The word ambition slipped through the barn like perfume covering decay. Winifred picked up one notice and held it where the tenants could see. "This paper says, 'I ordered Mrs. Bellwether's cottage cleared by Michaelmas.'" The old woman's mouth tightened. "It says my husband's bit of garden is to be taken too." "Yes." Winifred's fingers closed once around the paper. For one fierce second, she wanted to tear the lie into pieces. The paper bent beneath her grip. The room saw it. She stopped before the tear ran fully through. Then she laid the half-torn notice flat upon the table and smoothed it with both hands. "I nearly destroyed evidence because it offended me. That would have been foolish." Elias looked at her then with something that was not admiration alone. It was pain, because he understood too late how evidence had been used against her and how carefully she now protected even what wounded her. Pike cleared his throat. "Your Grace's initials are visible." "So is the date," Winifred answered. "The morning of my wedding, before I had entered Wetherbourne House, before I had seen any Larkmead ledger, before I had used my married title in writing." "A prepared instruction may be dated in anticipation," Pike said. "By whom?" The barn stilled. Pike's lips parted, then closed. Lady Althea stepped in softly. "Surely the question is not whether her Grace physically held the pen at that precise hour, but whether she gave encouragement to those acting on her behalf. Families do discuss arrangements before weddings. Sir Dorian has always been devoted to his sister's advancement." Winifred looked at her. "You speak confidently of my brother's devotion. I speak as a friend concerned that you may be blamed more harshly than you deserve." "No," Winifred said. "You speak as if blame has already found me and needs only gentler clothing." A rustle went through the tenants. Mrs. Bellwether's eyes sharpened. Winifred turned back to the table. "Mrs. Crewe, the ledger." The housekeeper brought the open rent ledger with hands that shook only slightly. Winifred placed it beside the notices and showed the changed hand, the darker ink, the repeated phrase, after Duchess's order. Then she opened her notebook to the rubbing, taken from the pressure marks on the page beneath the missing sheet. There was a page cut out of this ledger. The pressure left behind includes these words: "No removal without witnessed consent of Her Grace after solemnization." Mr. Venn lifted his head. "That clause was old, Your Grace. My father spoke of it." "Then your memory may be the first honest witness today," Winifred said. Pike's face had gone the color of old paste. Lady Althea's smile thinned. "Pressure marks are delicate things. A determined person may read what she wishes." "Indeed," Winifred said. "That is why I asked you all to bring what you had. Not so I might be believed without proof, but so the proof would not depend upon me alone." Thomas Cale laid down his notice. "Mine has a blot." Winifred looked at it. Near the lower margin, beneath the false initials, a dark smear crossed the paper. The shape was irregular, but familiar. It matched the pressure mark from the missing ledger page where a heavy hand had dragged ink over the word consent. Mrs. Fenby leaned closer. The same blotting pattern. Elias spoke at last, not loudly, but the barn heard him. That notice and the ledger were marked from the same preparation. Pike snapped. "Your Grace cannot mean to accept peasant papers over formal instruction." The word peasant struck the room like a thrown stone. Elias's eyes hardened, but Winifred raised one hand slightly. He stopped. That small obedience changed the room more than a reprimand would have done. Winifred faced Pike. "Mr. Pike, these people are not peasant papers. They are His Grace's tenants, and today they are witnesses." Mrs. Bellwether took one step nearer the table. "Then hear mine. He brought my notice himself." Her finger pointed at Pike. "He said a new duchess had expensive tastes, and old cottages stood in the way of progress." A low anger moved through the barn. Pike looked toward Lady Althea, too quickly. Elias saw it. Winifred saw Elias see it, and for the first time that day, she felt not rescued but accompanied. Althea lifted her chin. "Fear makes memory theatrical." Winifred's voice quieted. "No, fear makes memory precise." She turned to the tenants. "If any among you wish to blame me, do it while I stand here. I will not hide from the harm done in my name. But I ask this of you. Help me prove whose hand placed that harm there." Silence followed. Then old Mr. Venn removed his hat fully and placed it against his chest. "There's a copy," he said, "of the old clause, not in the steward's keeping. My father kept it when the late Duchess settled the ridge dispute." Every head turned. Pike made a small sound before he could stop himself. Lady Althea's face lost its softness for one naked instant. Winifred felt the air change. Not absolution, not yet, but the first hinge of a locked door giving way. After the meeting broke in uneasy fragments, she stepped into the vestry with Mrs. Fenby and Elias. Only then did her composure falter. She set both hands on the table edge, breathing carefully. Because she would not collapse where the tenants might see and mistake exhaustion for defeat. Elias stood across from her, not touching, not commanding. Then he opened his hand, palm up, between them. No claim, no demand. Simply presence offered and waiting. Winifred looked at it for a long moment. Then, because the barn had nearly swallowed her whole, and because he had not spoken over her, when power would have made it easy, she placed her hand in his fingers closed gently around hers. This time, he did not release at once. She did not ask him to, for several minutes. While the last tenants' voices faded beyond the door, she kept her hand in his and named the people she feared losing. Mrs. Bellwether, Thomas Cale's wife, the Morton sisters, old Mr. Venn with his bees. Elias listened to every name as if it were a vow. "I believe you," he said. "Only that. No love, no plea. no forgiveness stolen too early. Winifred closed her eyes for one breath, and the first repair entered quietly, not as comfort, but as belief. The copy of the old lease clause arrived wrapped in oilcloth and suspicion, carried not by a solicitor, nor by a steward, but by old Mr. Venn himself, who came to the priory the next morning, with his hat in both hands and rain shining on the shoulders of his brown coat. He would not enter the drawing-room. He asked for the Duchess at the side door, as though truth, if it had survived this long among tenants, ought not be made to climb a grand staircase before anyone honoured it. Winifred went to him without delay, Mrs. Fenby following close enough to satisfy propriety, and far enough to let dignity breathe. Elias had been in the estate office with Mr. Aldrin's earlier notes spread before him. But when Mallow brought word that a tenant had come with a paper, he appeared in the passage and stopped at Winifred's left shoulder. Not ahead of her, not between her and the man. That too she noticed, because grief had made her notice everything. Mr. Venn looked first at the Duke, then at Winifred, and his weathered hands tightened around the packet. "My father kept it after the Ridge quarrel, your grace. Said great houses remember what profits them and forget what protects poor folk." "Your father was wise," Winifred said. "May I see it?" The old man gave her the packet, not Elias. The distinction settled over the small stone passage with quiet force. Elias saw it, and if it stung him, he did not show it except by lowering his gaze. Winifred unfolded the oilcloth on the narrow table near the servants' entrance. Inside lay a copied lease clause, brown at the edges, the ink faded but legible. Her eyes found the words at once. "No, removal of North Ridge tenants shall be made upon newly assumed marital authority, unless consent be given by Her Grace, Duchess of Wetherbourne, after solemnization, and witnessed before rector, steward, and 2 lawful tenants of the Ridge." Mrs. Fenby gave a soft, controlled breath. Elias leaned closer but did not touch the page. "That is the language from the pressure marks," he said. "Yes," Winifred answered. She traced above the words without laying her finger on the ink. "They cut the page from the tithe barn ledger because this clause made the forged notices useless unless I appeared to consent after marriage, or appeared cruel enough," Elias said, voice low, "that no one would question whether consent had been witnessed." The words cost him. She heard it. Mr. Venn watched them both with the patience of a man who had seen weather humble, better-dressed people than himself. "There were always witnesses for Ridge matters," he said. "Old Duchess Deverick set that down after a steward tried to clear a widow's pig run for grazing rights. She said, 'A house that can't look a widow in the face has no business taking her door.'" Winifred looked at him. "Then we shall look everyone in the face." Elias's head turned toward her. "I can seize the ledgers now. Pike, Dorian, Althea. I can bring Aldrin north and settle it privately before more fear spreads." He spoke with restraint, but Winifred heard the old instinct beneath it, the ducal need to close the door, command the room, and call silence protection. The offer might have pleased another woman. It might even have pleased the Winifred who had entered St. George's with myrtle in her prayer book and hope carefully folded end beneath duty. But exile had taught her the shape of hidden things. "No," she said. Elias became still. "No, no private correction." She folded the oilcloth back from the clause so the words remained visible. The lie was not private, Mrs. Bellwether's door was marked in public. The notices were delivered to cottages. The tenants looked at me as if I had come north to finish what the paper began. If you settle this in a study, it will become one more thing done over their heads. I meant to spare you another scene of accusation. You meant to spare yourself the sight of what your first scene made possible. Silence entered the passage. Mr. Venn looked down at his hat. Mrs. Fenby did not move. Elias accepted the words as if he had chosen at last not to lift a hand against truth merely because it struck him. Yes, he said, perhaps I did. The honesty unsettled her, but she did not soften the demand. There must be a public estate reckoning in the tithe barn. Tenants present. Rector present. Steward, if he can be found, Mr. Pike. Lady Althea, Sir Dorian, Mrs. Crewe, Mallow, Mrs. Fenby, your solicitor when he arrives, or your written authority, until then every notice on the table, the lease clause beside the ledger, the prayer card, the wax, the pressure marks, no whispers, no arrangements. Elias looked at the old clause, then at her. And me? Winifred met his eyes. You may stand where truth needs your authority, but not where my voice should be. Something moved across his face that was nearly pain and nearly admiration. Tell me where to stand. She should not have felt the words in her chest. They were practical. Nothing more, yet the man who had once ordered her into a carriage now asked for a place instead of taking one. Beside me, she said, not before me. His answer came quietly. Then beside you is where I shall be. No hand touched, no vow passed between them. Still, the air changed with a kind of intimacy more dangerous than touch, because it asked for trust where trust had been broken. Mr. Venn cleared his throat. If your grace means to have the Ridge folk present, they'll come. Angry, some of them, but they'll come. They have earned their anger, Winifred said. So have I. By noon, messages had gone out across Larkmead. Mallow sent a groom to the rectory. Mrs. Crewe dispatched a footman to find the acting steward, who had grown curiously difficult to locate since the rent day meeting. Elias wrote to Mr. Aldrin with instructions to come north and bring every record of Sir Dorian's inquiries. Winifred herself wrote the summons to Dorian. Every line calm enough to insult him more than rage would have done. Sir Dorian Aveling is requested to attend Larkmead Priory regarding papers issued in his sister's married name and concerning mineral interests formally discussed under his direction. She sealed it without flourish. He will come, Elias said, from the far side of the estate office. He thinks charm can survive any room if he enters it smiling. Winifred glanced at him. You know him that well? No. I know men who believe women's reputations are doors they may open with borrowed keys. His eyes lowered to the letter. I was one, in a different coat. She had no ready answer. He did not ask for one. Before dusk, Dorian's reply came by hired rider, too quickly for innocence and too polished for surprise. He expressed grief that his dear sister had been distressed by estate confusion. He would come at once, bringing, as he wrote, proof that Winifred had discussed the North Ridge clearances before her marriage and wished them done briskly for the prosperity of her new house. Winifred read the sentence twice, not because she believed it, but because she recognized the shape of a trap built from familiarity. He means to use my old words, she said. Elias looked up sharply. What old words? Years ago, I wrote to him after he dismissed 2 servants without warning. I said, prosperity purchased by frightening dependence would rot under the floorboards. He mocked me for the phrase. She handed him the letter. If he has samples of my hand, he may have more than signatures. Elias's expression darkened, but he did not reach for command. What do you need? The question, simple and disciplined, steadied her more than outrage would have done. Every letter I wrote to Dorian that can be found in my old trunks. Mrs. Fenby can help me identify phrases he might twist, and Mr. Ven's clause must be copied twice, with him present, so no one can say we altered it. Done. And Elias. It was the first time she had used his Christian name since London. He went utterly still. The sound seemed to surprise them both. Winifred looked down at Dorian's letter before continuing. If my brother provokes me, do not answer for me. His voice was softer when he replied, I won't. If Lady Althea pities me, do not defend me before I have spoken. I won't. If the tenants look at me as if I am a monster, do not cover that look with rank. I need to see what the lie did. For a moment he said nothing. Then he bowed his head. Not as Duke to Duchess. As husband to wife, though neither of them was ready to say the word without pain. I understand. Outside, the evening bell sounded from the chapel, thin and weathered in the wet air. The public reckoning was not yet upon them, but its shape had entered the house. In the corridors, servants whispered less and moved with purpose. In the village, tenants carried folded notices to one another and spoke of the old clause. On the south road, Sir Dorian Aveling travelled north with a sealed packet and a confident smile, certain that his sister's silence could still be arranged if enough people gathered to watch her fail. Winifred stood at the estate office window long after Elias left to send the final rider. In the glass, she saw her own reflection, pale but upright. No longer the bride on the silver tray's far side, no longer the woman waiting for a duke to decide what truth had weight. Behind her lay tenant names, a stolen prayer card, a cut ledger, and an old clause saved by a poor man's father. Because memory sometimes lived longer outside great houses than within them, she placed her hand over Dorian's letter and felt no tremor. Let him come with proof. Let Althea come with pity. Let Elias stand beside her and learn how costly beside could be. The barn that had nearly made her a villain would become the room where she chose not to hide. Sir Dorian Aveling arrived at Larkmead with sunshine on his carriage wheels and a smile bright enough to suggest. He had mistaken accusation for invitation. The morning had cleared after rain, leaving the priory lawns washed, the chapel stones dark, and the road from the south ribboned with puddles that caught the pale sky. Winifred watched from the estate office window as her brother descended with the old grace that had once made creditors wait longer than wisdom advised. He adjusted his gloves before he looked at the house. That small vanity pierced her more sharply than anger might have done. Dorian had always believed presentation could outrun consequence. As children, he had smiled over broken china, missing coins, unpaid bills, and their mother's tired eyes. Now he had come with a sealed packet beneath his arm, and a confidence that had been fed by years of being forgiven because he was charming when cornered. Elias stood several feet behind Winifred, near the table where her old letters had been sorted through the previous night. He did not come to the window. He had learned, perhaps, that some battles entered the room before the door opened. You do not have to receive him alone, he said. I know. That was not an instruction. I know that too. The answer made him quiet. A footman announced Sir Dorian in a voice that tried not to show curiosity. Dorian entered, as if the estate office were a drawing room, arranged for his comfort. He kissed the air above Winifred's hand before she could decide whether to offer it, and bowed to Elias with just enough deference to avoid insult. My dear sister, he said, warmth poured over steel. This distress has grown beyond all proportion. I came the instant your summons reached me. How swift brotherly devotion becomes when ledgers are opened, Winifred said. His smile flickered. Still wounded, I see. Understandable. New rank, rural confusion, tenants with grievances. It would overwhelm any woman. Elias's face sharpened, but he held silence. Winifred noticed. Dorian noticed too, and misread it as ducal uncertainty. He placed his sealed packet on the table. I have brought proof that you were aware of the North Ridge arrangements before your marriage. Mrs. Fenvey sat near the hearth, sewing untouched in her lap. Mrs. Crewe stood by the door as household witness. Mallow waited beyond it. Winifred broke the seal herself. Inside were 2 folded pages. The first was a copy of a letter in a hand close to hers, too close at a glance, and not close enough under pain. It described the clearing of aged cottages as necessary for prosperity. It used the phrase prosperity purchased by frightening dependents, but turned against itself, twisted until warning became endorsement. The second page bore her initials, copied with careful pressure. Her throat tightened before she permitted herself to speak. You kept my letters. A loving brother keeps many things. No, she said, a loving brother does not cut a woman's conscience apart and paste it into cruelty. Dorian gave a soft laugh, meant for Elias. You see how emotional she has become. Winifred always had a taste for moral phrases. I merely assumed she meant what she wrote. Read the original, she said, if you have it. He looked pained. After years? My dear, don't be unreasonable. Elias stepped forward at last, not between them, but to the side of the table. Mr. Pike will be asked whether these samples came through his hand. Dorian's gaze cooled. A duke might ask a clerk many things, and hear whatever fear invents. Then we shall hear him before witnesses. Dorian's smile returned. Thinner now. Before tenants? Before the rector? Before your servants? Surely your grace does not intend to parade family misunderstandings before labourers who cannot grasp the delicacy of estate interests. Winifred laid the forged letter flat. They grasp eviction. The room stilled. Dorian looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time seemed to understand that exile had not made her smaller. It had removed the last softness he knew how to use. You are making a spectacle of yourself, he said quietly. No, she answered. I am refusing to remain the spectacle you arranged. Before he could reply, hurried footsteps crossed the hall. Mallow opened the door to admit Reuben Pike, pale and damp at the temples, though the day was cool. He had evidently been summoned by Elias earlier and had hoped to arrive after Dorian's departure. Seeing them together robbed him of speech. Dorian turned on him with a smile full of warning. Mr. Pike, how useful. My sister has questions about papers she once understood perfectly well. Pike looked from Dorian to Elias, then to Winifred. His fingers twitched against his hat. I only carried what I was given. By whom? Winifred asked. Pike swallowed. Sir Dorian provided samples, phrases, old letters, said her grace, wished the notice language to resemble her hand should the Duke prefer proof of consent. Lady Marstow arranged access to the prayer book because the seal needed something bridal, something that would seem to connect the directive to the day. The confession did not arrive nobly. It came thin and frightened, dragged from a man who saw both rank and ruin closing in. But it came. Dorian's face lost colour under its polish. Lies from a clerk trying to save his place. Pike turned on him with sudden desperation. You said the missing ledger page was safe. You said without it the clause would be only tenant memory. The room seemed to narrow around the words. Winifred heard her own pulse. You have the missing page. Dorian recovered enough to lift his chin. I have no idea what this fellow means. Pike made a bitter sound. In the Marstow account book, you told me Lady Althea would keep it until the Duchess had been frightened into silence. Elias's voice cut low and controlled. "Where is the account book now?" Dorian stepped back. "This is absurd." "Where?" Elias repeated. Winifred did not need the answer to know that the page was real, that her own brother had helped remove the one document that might have saved 6 cottages from terror and her from disgrace. The knowledge did not break loudly. It opened beneath her like ice giving way. She had been ready for greed. She had been ready for cowardice. She had not been ready for the memory of Dorian, as a boy, stealing sugared almonds from her palm, and laughing because she always gave him the larger half. She closed the forged letter, not because she wished to preserve it, but because her hands needed purpose. "Enough for now," she said. Elias looked at her at once. "Winifred, enough." Her voice remained level. "Mr. Pike is not to leave the grounds. Sir Dorian may retire to the Blue Chamber under Mallow's observation until we decide when he will speak before the tenants." Dorian scoffed. "You cannot confine me." "No," Winifred said, "but you are very conscious of appearances, and leaving now would tell every person at Larkmead that you fear the barn more than you fear me." His eyes hardened. For one moment the charm vanished altogether, showing the mean panic underneath. Then he bowed with ugly precision. "As my sister commands." She waited until he left. She waited until Pike was escorted out separately. She waited until Mrs. Crewe and Mrs. Fenby lowered their eyes, with the mercy of women who knew composure could become a prison. Then Winifred walked out, through the side passage, across the wet grass, and into the chapel yard where the old myrtle leaned against the wall. She stopped there because there was nowhere farther she could go without beginning to run, and she would not run from her own brother's shadow. The air smelled of rain and leaf mold. The chapel door stood closed. She pressed one hand to the stone and breathed once, then again. Footsteps approached behind her and stopped at a respectful distance. Elias did not speak until Mrs. Fenby, who had followed more slowly, remained within sight near the gate and gave the smallest nod. "Do you want me to go?" he asked. The question nearly undid her, not because it was tender, but because it left the choice in her hands. "I do not know." "Then I will stay here until you know, and no nearer." She turned. His face held no demand, no performance of anguish for her to comfort, only responsibility. "He used my own words," she said. "I wrote to him about servants, about not frightening people who depended on him. I thought, if I said it beautifully enough, he might become ashamed." Elias looked at the wet ground. "I punished you for the kind of cruelty I now see you have spent your life resisting." The sentence entered her quietly and reached the place anger had been guarding. She shut her eyes. "Do not make me forgive you because you finally understand how badly you injured me." "I won't." His voice roughened. "Forgiveness is yours. The harm is mine." Her breath caught, not as sobbing, not yet, but as something long held finally recognizing air. "May I stay?" he asked again. Winifred opened her eyes. The man before her had crossed England. Yes, but more importantly, he had stopped crossing the last few feet without permission. She stepped toward him. Once. Then again, he did not move until she reached him. Then she placed her forehead against his chest and allowed his arms to come around her, carefully, as if holding grief that could still choose to leave. Her own hands closed in the damp cloth of his coat. It was not reconciliation. It was not surrender. It was the first place that did not ask her to stand upright while bleeding invisibly. Elias held her without claiming her, and when she drew back, he released her before she had to ask. Beyond the chapel wall, Larkmead waited. Dorian held the missing page's secret. Althea still smiled somewhere behind curtains. The tenants still needed truth. But for one brief, rain-scented moment, Winifred let herself be seen not as duchess, culprit, witness, or wronged wife, but as a woman whose heart had been struck by blood and paper, and had not broken. By the next morning, the tithe barn had ceased to belong to dust, grain, and rumour. It belonged to proof. Winifred entered before breakfast with the keys in her hand and Mrs. Fenby beside her, while Mallow and 2 footmen carried trestle tables from the Priory stores. The air still held the smell of damp straw, but she ordered the upper shutters opened, and pale light fell across the boards in long bars, revealing every scar on the old wood. Good. Let the room show its age. Let no one imagine truth required polish to have authority. She placed the tenant notices on the first table, each labelled by cottage and hand that delivered it. Mrs. Bellwether's half-worn notice lay nearest the front, beside the one Winifred had nearly torn during rent-day anger and then preserved. On the second table went Mr. Venn's copied lease clause, the open rent ledger, the graphite rubbing of the pressure marks, and the torn stub where the missing page had once lived. On the third, Elias placed the false wedding, directive, the ivory prayer card, under a small pane of glass borrowed from a broken picture frame, black wax samples, and the note from the Grantham posting house clerk confirming Reuben Pike's purchase of estate paper and sealing wax. He did not arrange them above hers. He waited until she indicated where each belonged. That should not have mattered. It did. The prayer card here, she said, not at the centre. Elias looked at her. It is the object that proves access. It proves access to me, she answered. The tenants' homes are the centre. He accepted the correction without defence, and set the card where she pointed, to the side of the directive, close enough to show the wax stain, not close enough to make her bridal loss more important than their fear. Mrs. Fenby watched from the end of the table with eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Crewe copied labels in a careful hand. Mallow checked that no door could be opened without notice. It was Elias who suggested posting men at each entrance. Not guards, Winifred said at once. He paused. Witnesses, then? Yes, if you place guards. Lady Althea will say I needed force to make truth believable. Then witnesses. The old sharpness of command came near his mouth and did not pass it. The rector at the south door, Mallow at the west, Mr. Venn near the lease clause, if he consents. No liveried intimidation. Winifred looked down at the order of papers, so he would not see how carefully she had heard him change. That will do. He stood beside her, close, but not touching. Between them lay the directive that had exiled her. Beyond it lay the proof that might restore her. The nearness was not peace, but it was no longer threat. That, too, was a kind of dangerous progress. Before noon, Lady Althea made her first move. She did not enter the barn. She sent a maid with a message for Mrs. Bellwether, inviting the old woman to take tea privately at the Priory so that the strain of public proceedings might be spared her. Winifred read the note once and handed it to Elias. His eyes darkened. She means to keep the widow away, or persuade her that I do. I can forbid Althea from sending another message. You can, Winifred said, but first I will answer this one. She wrote to Mrs. Bellwether herself, and sent Mrs. Fenby with the reply. Not a footman. The widow was to come only if she wished. No testimony would be demanded. No door would be marked again under Winifred's authority. By mid-afternoon, Mrs. Bellwether sent back one sentence in a crabbed hand. I will come, because I know my own threshold. Lady Althea's second move was less graceful. Pike, held at the Priory, under the polite fiction of awaiting formal questioning, asked to speak with the Duke alone. Elias refused the privacy and brought him instead to the old tack room adjoining the barn, where Winifred, Mrs. Fenby, and Mallow could hear. Pike looked ruined by the sight of more than one listener. Fear had thinned him. His respectable coat hung badly, and his fingers worried the brim of his hat until the felt bent. "I was paid to carry papers," he said. "That is all." "You were paid by whom?" Winifred asked. Sir Dorian gave the writing samples. He swallowed. Lady Marstow gave access and instruction. She said the prayer card would make the Duke believe the order came from the wedding table. She said His Grace was a man who trusted seals more than scenes. Elias took the blow in silence. Winifred did not look at him. Pike continued, voice lowering. "The missing page is not destroyed. The room changed. Even Mallow's breath seemed to stop." "Where is it?" Elias asked. Pike looked at the floor. "Inside a Marstow account book, dark red binding. Lady Marstow keeps it in her travelling case, or kept it. Sir Dorian said she would burn it if the Duchess did not withdraw the tenant meeting." "Did she burn it?" Winifred asked. "I don't know. Do not decorate ignorance," she said. "Tell only what you know." Shame flashed across Pike's face. "I saw the corner singed, not the whole page." Sir Dorian laughed that a burned edge made old paper look more convincing if anyone found it. Elias turned to Mallow. "Find Lady Marstow's maid, quietly. Ask whether a red account book was unpacked, and do not frighten the maid," Winifred added. "If she has seen anything, fear may make her loyal to the wrong person." Mallow bowed and went. Pike looked toward Elias, then Winifred. "If I give a written statement, Sir Dorian will say I invented it to save myself." "He will," Winifred said. "So write only what other evidence can stand beside." That startled him more than accusation would have done. She took a sheet from the table and placed it before him. "Names, dates, materials purchased. Who gave you the samples? Who told you where my prayer book would be? Nothing more." Pike sat and began to write. His hand shook, but the words came. Near dusk, Mallow returned with a small package wrapped in brown cloth. Behind him stood Lady Althea's maid, a frightened girl named Susan, with red eyes and a cap slightly askew. She curtsied so low that Winifred almost stepped forward to stop her. "Your Grace, I didn't know what it was." The contraction came out on a whisper. "Her ladyship told me it was an old household account. She put it near the fire after Mr. Pike came. I saw smoke. I took it away when she went to answer Sir Dorian." Lady Althea's dark red account book lay inside the cloth. Its cover smelled faintly of smoke. Between 2 pages of meaningless household sums rested the missing ledger page, its upper corner burned away, but its body intact. Winifred did not touch it at first. No one did. The page that had been cut from Larkmead's own memory had returned singed, but readable. Elias stood very still. "Mrs. Fenby," Winifred said, "will you witness its condition before we lift it?" "Gladly." They recorded the scorch, the torn edge, the matching ledger stub, the clause language, and the names of every person present when it was found. Elias sent for the rector. Susan was given tea in the kitchen and told she would not be punished for obeying conscience after fear. When at last the page lay beside the pressure rubbing, the match was unmistakable. No removal without witnessed consent. After solemnization, rector, steward, 2 lawful tenants. A clause plain enough for a cottage hearth and strong enough to shame a great house. Winifred stared at it until the words blurred. She had thought proof would feel like triumph. It felt heavier. Proof meant the harm had been deliberate. It meant Mrs. Bellwether's marked door, the tenants' sleepless nights, the stair of the breakfast room, and the long road of exile had all been built, piece by piece, by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. Elias came no closer. Winifred. She looked up. Candlelight had softened the road weariness in his face without erasing it. "Whatever tomorrow costs me," he said, "I will not purchase peace with your silence." The words entered the barn quietly, and for once she did not need to defend herself from them. "Remember that when Lady Althea weeps," she said, "I will. Remember it when Dorian calls me ungrateful. I remember it when the tenants look at you to speak, because you are the Duke." He held her gaze. "I will look at you first." Her composure had carried her through papers, names, smoke, and betrayal. But something in that answer reached the tired place beneath discipline. She turned slightly away, not to hide from him, but to gather herself. He did not follow. Then, after a moment, he said, "May I touch your face?" The question was so quiet that only she and Mrs. Fenby, tactfully examining the far table, could have heard. Winifred should have said no, not because she wanted to, but because wanting anything from him still felt like handing a candle to a man who had once mistaken flame for guilt. Yet he had asked. He had waited. He had spent the day guarding evidence instead of commanding her grief. She nodded. Elias lifted his hand slowly and touched the side of her face with his fingertips. Barely more than warmth at her temple, where tension had been gathering all day. She leaned into his palm for one brief breath. His expression changed, not with victory, but with wonder disciplined by remorse. Then he lowered his hand before tenderness could ask more than she had given. Outside, the evening bell rang thinly across Larkmead. Inside the barn, the tables of proof waited beneath candlelight. Notices, ledger, prayer card, wax clause, confession, burned page. Tomorrow the tenants would come. So would Dorian, so would Lady Althea, with tears ready and explanations polished. Winifred laid her palm flat beside the recovered clause and felt not safety, but readiness. This time, no one would send her north to be silent. This time, every paper bearing her name would answer to her voice. Rain came before dawn and made the road to Larkmead sound like a warning. It struck the priory windows in hard silver lines, filled the ruts beyond the chapel gate, and turned the lane from the posting road into a brown ribbon of delay. By breakfast, the final witnesses Elias had sent for had not arrived. By noon, Mallow reported that the rector's boy had seen a hired chaise stalled near the King's Arms, the small inn 2 miles from the priory, where the lower bridge had flooded enough to frighten the horses. In that chaise, if Hartley's message was true, sat Mrs. Vale from Wetherbourne House, the woman who had arranged the wedding gifts, and Jenny Price, the young antechamber maid who had vanished into service at a cousin's household. 2 days after the wedding breakfast, Elias received the news in the tithe barn, where the tables of proof waited beneath cloths to protect them from damp. Winifred saw his jaw tighten, and for one moment she recognized the old Duke in him, the man who believed roads, servants, weather, and truth should align when commanded. Then he looked at her first. "The witnesses are delayed at the King's Arms," he said. "The chaise cannot cross the lower bridge until the water drops. I would go myself if you agree." "I will go with you," Winifred said. Lady Althea, who had drifted near the barn door in pearl-grey silk and injured innocence, lifted her brows. "My dear Winifred, surely that is unnecessary. The weather is dreadful, and tomorrow's little gathering will be difficult enough without exhausting yourself." "Then I shall be tired with purpose," Winifred answered. Elias did not hide the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth. Not amusement exactly. but admiration kept quiet because it had not been invited to display itself. Mrs. Fenby was summoned. A closed carriage was ordered. By the time they left the Priory yard, rain had softened the world into grey glass. The journey to the King's Arms should have been nothing, a country distance fit for a fair morning. But the wheels sank twice, and a groom had to walk the horses around the worst of the flooded lane. Winifred sat beside Mrs. Fenby, with Elias opposite, his hat resting on one knee, his gloves damp at the seams. No one spoke for the first mile. The carriage had once been the shape of exile. Now it carried them toward proof. That did not make the space simple. At the inn, the parlour was small, respectable, and smelling faintly of peat smoke, wet wool, and lemon peel. Mrs. Vale, stiff with indignation at having been delayed in a public house, was given tea in the adjoining room. Jenny Price, pale and frightened, was placed near the fire with Mrs. Fenby, who spoke to her as if fear were an ailment that could be warmed without being scolded. The young maid's statement came in pieces. Lady Althea had entered the antechamber after the ceremony. She had said the bride's prayer book must be moved away from spilled orange blossom water. Jenny had seen her lift the small ivory card from inside it and pass it to a man in a dark coat near the service passage. Jenny had thought the man was a clerk sent by Sir Dorian because he carried estate papers. Later, when whispers began, Mrs. Vale warned the girl not to repeat confusion about a lady of rank unless she wished never to serve in a decent house again. "I didn't know what they'd done with it," Jenny whispered, twisting her apron. "I only knew her Grace looked for it, and then everyone was staring at her." Winifred stood very still. The room narrowed around that one memory, not because it surprised her, but because it placed a living witness beside the stolen card. Elias asked no leading question. He did not thunder. He simply wrote the statement in his own hand, then read it aloud for Jenny to correct. When she signed with a shaking mark and Mrs. Vale reluctantly witnessed the timing, the last blank space in the chain closed. Lady Althea had touched the prayer card. Pike had used it. Dorian had supplied the purpose. Elias folded the paper and laid it beside the oilcloth packet. "That is enough," he said, then looked at Winifred. "Legally, socially, morally, enough." Mrs. Fenby took Jenny to the innkeeper's wife for broth and quiet. Mrs. Vale remained in the adjoining room, composing her embarrassment into future respectability. The private parlour door was left ajar, as propriety required, and Mrs. Fenby's figure could be seen now and again, moving beyond it. Rain blurred the small window. Elias and Winifred stood on opposite sides of the parlour table, the signed statement between them. For hours she had been held upright by purpose. Now that proof had arrived, the next question waited. Not whether she was innocent. Whether innocence restored anything beyond her name. Elias seemed to understand the same thing. Because he did not reach for the document, he looked at her with the restraint of a man, standing before a door he had once broken and did not dare touch without permission. "When this is done," he said, "I will restore your name publicly. I will secure the tenants in writing. I will cut Dorian off from every settlement influence he hoped to exploit. Lady Althea will lose Deverick patronage, and Pike will answer to Mr. Aldrin and the proper authorities." "That is justice," Winifred said. "It is the beginning of it." He drew a slow breath. "If, after that, you want a legal separation, I will not contest it. I will not hide you at Larkmead, nor command you to Ravensholt, nor ask society to pretend we are healed, because scandal has been corrected." The words struck harder than any plea could have done. She looked at him through the rain-dim light. "You would let me go?" Yes, his voice roughened. Not because I want distance, because I have no right to call your return forgiveness if you are not free to refuse it. Winifred's hand rested on the back of a chair. Do you want forgiveness, Elias, or possession restored? He closed his eyes for a moment, as if the question found its mark exactly. When he opened them, there was no duke left in his expression, only the man who had crossed England and found that apology did not shorten the road. Neither, if either costs you truth. I want you free enough that if you ever stand beside me again, I know you chose it. I want to be worthy of the room you enter, not the title that makes others let me in. I am in love with my wife, and I know love cannot be used as a summons. The fire cracked softly. Outside, a horse stamped in the wet yard. Winifred felt the sentence move through her, not as triumph, not as surrender, but as a warmth she had no wish to kill, simply because pain had come before it. You say that now, she whispered. Tomorrow, before tenants and servants and my brother's smirking face, you may want to take the room back. I may want many wrong things, he said. I will not obey them. The answer was imperfect, in precisely the way honesty was imperfect. It did not promise that pride had vanished. It promised he would not crown it again. Winifred came around the table slowly. Elias did not move, not even when she stood close enough to see the rain on his sleeve and the sleepless shadow beneath his eyes. If I stay, she said, it will not be because you crossed England. I know. It will not be because you are sorry. I know. It will be because I believe the man asking now is not the man who sent me away. His breath caught. Still, he did not touch her. May I kiss you, Winifred? The question entered the room with all the gentleness his first judgment had lacked. She could have refused. The door was open. Mrs. Fenby was near. Her name had not yet been cleared before the tenants. Nothing forced her toward him except her own will, and that was why she stepped closer. Yes, she said, her voice steadier than her heart. Because I choose it. His hand rose only after her answer, and even then it touched her lightly, just at the edge of her shoulder, asking again without words. She lifted her face. The kiss was restrained, warm, and brief enough for propriety, but it carried everything neither of them could safely say in a public inn while rain trapped witnesses beyond the bridge. Remorse, want hope, fear choice. When they parted, he did not hold her there. She stayed because she wished to, one breath longer, her hand resting against his coat where the ivory prayer card had once accused him from within. Then Mrs. Fenby's footsteps sounded in the passage, and Winifred stepped back first, not ashamed. Elias let her go, and the look in his eyes made no claim upon the leaving. By the time the rain softened to mist, the chaise was ready to return to Larkmead. Jenny's signed statement lay sealed in the evidence packet. The final proof had arrived. At dawn, the tithe barn would fill again, and this time Winifred would not stand beneath accusation waiting to be answered. She would carry her own truth into the room, with the Duke beside her, not as shield, not as judge, but as the first man who had learned too late that love without belief was only another form of power. At dawn, the tithe barn doors stood open, and Larkmead came to witness what had once been done to it in secret. Mist clung low to the ridge fields. The floorboards were still dark from the previous day's damp, but candles burned along the trestle tables, their light touching every arranged paper without hiding its scars. Tenant notices lay in one row. The recovered lease page lay beside the rent ledger, its burned corner recorded and visible. The ivory prayer card rested beneath glass, wax-stained and myrtle-marked, no longer a private bridal thing but a witness that had survived theft. Jenny Price's statement was folded beside Mrs. Vale's reluctant signature. Pike's written account, thinner in ink, but plain in meaning, waited under Mr. Aldrin's hand. Winifred entered not as a woman dragged before judgment, but as the one who had set the room in order. Mrs. Fenby walked behind her. Elias stood at her side, exactly where she had told him to stand. Not before her, not behind her. Beside her, and silent until silence became cowardice. The tenants gathered first, faces wary beneath caps and bonnets. Mrs. Bellwether took a place near the front, one hand around the handle of her cane, her gaze fixed on the chalk-free future she did not yet dare imagine. Thomas Cale and his wife stood near the wall. The Morton sisters held one another's gloves. Old Mr. Venn placed his hat against his chest as if the barn had become a chapel. Then came the rector, grave and uncomfortable. Mrs. Crewe, Mallow, and the household staff lined the far side. Mr. Aldrin set his case upon the table. Reuben Pike entered pale and shaking between two footmen who did not touch him but made departure difficult. Sir Dorian Aveling arrived in a coat too elegant for a rural inquiry, his smile bright until he saw the recovered page. Lady Althea Marstow entered last, dressed in soft grey, with eyes already wet enough to suggest injury before anyone had accused her. Elias moved one step forward. Every face turned toward the Duke. He looked at Winifred first, then at the room. Before her Grace speaks, I will name my own fault. On my wedding day, I accepted a paper without granting my wife the hearing any honest person deserved. I sent her from London under accusation. I placed her among tenants, frightened by lies bearing her name. That was not justice. It was pride dressed in authority. No truth spoken here today lessens that harm. A murmur shifted through the barn. Dorian's jaw tightened. Althea lowered her lashes. Elias stepped back. Winifred felt the weight of every eye pass from him to her. This time, it did not crush, it steadied. She laid her hand near Mrs. Bellwether's notice. You were told I wished to remove 6 households from the North Ridge, she began. You were told I signed instructions for clearances, so my brother might profit from mineral leases. You were told this before I had ever entered Larkmead as your Duchess. I will not ask you to forget that fear. I ask only that you look at how it was made. She lifted the false directive. This was presented at my wedding breakfast. It bears my married title and a date that placed its creation while I stood in St. George's, Hanover Square, before the altar. I could not have written it then. She placed it down and uncovered the prayer card. This card was stolen from my prayer book after the ceremony. It bears the same myrtle stain found beneath the wax seal of that directive. Jenny Price saw Lady Althea remove it from the antechamber table and pass it toward the service passage, where Mr. Pike waited with estate papers. Althea gave a soft gasp. A frightened maid's fancy. Jenny, standing near Mrs. Fenby, trembled but did not retreat. Mr. Aldrin unfolded her statement. The maid's account is supported by Mrs. Vale's timing and by the physical stain upon the card and seal. Winifred continued before Althea could turn tears into theatre. These notices were then delivered to cottagers in my name. One was handed to Mrs. Bellwether by Mr. Pike, who told her a new duchess had expensive tastes. Mrs. Bellwether's voice cut clear across the room. He did. Pike covered his face with one hand, then lowered it when Elias looked at him. Winifred opened the ledger. In the tithe barn book, newer ink marked cottages as cleared after Duchess's order. A page was cut out. The pressure marks beneath it showed the missing words. No removal without witnessed consent of her grace after solemnization. She placed the recovered page beside the rubbing. That page was found in Lady Althea's red Marstow account book, with its corner burned but its words still legible. The clause required witnesses before any removal. No such witnessed consent exists because I never gave it. Dorian laughed once, badly. My sister has always had a gift for performance. A few stains, a maid's recollection, a clerk desperate to save himself. And your letters, Elias said quietly. Mr. Aldrin opened Dorian's packet and Pike's confession beside it. Sir Dorian supplied handwriting samples and phrases from Her Grace's old correspondence. Mr. Pike states he was paid to prepare notice language resembling her hand. Payment scraps from Sir Dorian's account match the sums recorded here. Pike looked at Dorian with sudden bitterness. You promised I'd be placed in a better office when it was done. Dorian turned scarlet. You insolent little coward. Cowardice recognizes its employer, Winifred said. The room went utterly still. She turned to Lady Althea. You did not need the cottagers. You needed me disgraced before my husband could know me. Althea's tears vanished as if wiped by heat. You were nothing, a quiet Aveling girl with no brilliance, no influence, no understanding of the circles you entered. Elias would have tired of your virtue by Michaelmas. Elias's voice was low. You will not use my name as if I were the prize that excused your cruelty. Althea looked at him with open fury. You believed it because you wished to. Don't lay all your shame at my feet. I do not, he said. I carry mine publicly. That answer ended her more thoroughly than denial. Winifred faced the tenants. You were not mistaken to be afraid. A great name appeared on paper, and paper has power when those beneath it are not heard. But hear me now. No cottage on the North Ridge will be cleared under that lie. No widow will lose her threshold for my brother's debts. No tenant's memory will be treated as less than a gentleman's seal. Old Mr. Venn bowed his head. Mrs. Bellwether's mouth trembled once before she pressed it firm. Only then did Elias step forward again, waiting until Winifred inclined her head. By my authority as Duke of Wetherbourne, Sir Dorian Aveling is removed from any influence over Her Grace's settlement interests and from any negotiation concerning Larkmead. Mr. Pike is dismissed from all Deverick business and will answer, through Mr. Aldrin, to the proper legal authorities. Lady Althea Marstow is barred from every Deverick house and from any patronage under my name. The North Ridge protections are reaffirmed in writing today, witnessed by the rector, the solicitor, and the tenants themselves. Dorian began to speak, saw no ally left in the room, and stopped. Althea stood pale with rage, no longer tragic, only exposed. Winifred looked at the tenants, not at them. If any of you wish the notices returned, you may keep them as proof of what was attempted. If you wish them burned after copies are made, that will be your choice. Mrs. Bellwether stepped forward. I'll keep mine until the new lease is signed. After that, I'll burn it in my own hearth. A sound moved through the barn, not applause, not triumph, but something steadier, belief. Elias turned from the tenants to Winifred. Before all of them, he lowered himself to one knee. The barn seemed to stop breathing. Winifred, he said, I ask forgiveness, but I do not demand return. I love you, Winifred, not because you have forgiven me, not because you are my Duchess, but because you are the woman I should have believed when belief would have cost me pride. Her heart moved toward him with pain still inside it, and with choice stronger than pain. She stepped forward and offered him her hand. He took it as if it were grace he had no right to hold tightly. I love you, Elias, she said, clear enough for the room to hear, but I will only stand beside a man who remembers that love is not command. He bowed his head over her hand, not kissing it, not turning tenderness into display, simply holding it because she had offered it. Around them, the tenants watched the woman once accused of stealing their homes stand vindicated among the papers meant to destroy her. The prayer card caught a thin beam of morning light beneath its glass, and for the first time since London, it looked less like something stolen than something returned. Several weeks later, Mrs. Bellwether washed her own threshold before sunrise. Though no chalk mark remained there to trouble her, she did it because the new lease lay folded on her kitchen table, signed, witnessed, and sealed with a mark that had not been forced from fear. The cottage door, once branded for removal, now opened onto a garden where late spring had begun to soften the ridge. Winifred stood at the gate with Elias beside her, not as visitors come to inspect gratitude, but as witnesses to a wrong set down in writing and then corrected where life actually lived. Mrs. Bellwether did not curtsy until she chose to. When she did, it was brief and firm. "Your Grace," she said to Winifred, "the roof men came yesterday." "Did they mend the west corner?" Winifred asked. "They did," grumbled the whole while, which tells me they worked honestly. Elias's mouth moved, almost smiling. Mrs. Bellwether looked at him next. There was respect in her face, but not forgetfulness. That was as it should be. "Your Grace," she said, "the clause is copied properly copied, witnessed by the rector, Mr. Aldrin, Mr. Venn, and 2 tenants of the ridge," Elias answered, "and filed where no steward may misplace it without every witness knowing." The old widow nodded. "Good. Great houses should have more than one memory." Winifred held the woman's gaze and felt something inside her settle. "That is why we asked you to keep one." Mrs. Bellwether reached into her apron pocket and drew out the old eviction notice. The paper worn soft from fear, folded and unfolded by lamplight. "I kept it until the lease was signed, as I said I would." She moved to the small hearth inside the cottage. Winifred and Elias remained at the doorway while Mrs. Bellwether set one corner to the flame. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished without drama. No applause, no speech. Only a widow watching threat become ash in her own home. By noon, the same quiet justice had moved across Larkmead. Thomas Cale's wife signed for repairs to the byre wall. The Morton sisters received confirmation that their linen work for the priory would continue at fair payment. Old Mr. Venn was asked to sit with Mr. Aldrin and identify every remembered protection his father had spoken of, so custom could no longer be dismissed as village gossip. Pike's written confession had ruined his clerkship beyond repair. Mr. Aldrin sent him to answer under proper legal process, and no Deverick office would employ him again. Sir Dorian Aveling's punishment came less publicly, but more deeply than spectacle. His creditors, learning he had lost access to any influence over Winifred's settlement or Deverick negotiation, moved with the speed of men who smelled weakness. He was forced to sell horses, plate, and the last sentimental portrait he had never valued until it gained a price. He wrote once, accusing Winifred of unnatural hardness. She returned the letter unopened, marked by Mallow in a neat hand. Her Grace receives no appeal from the man who sold her name for a lease. Lady Althea Marstow's consequence was quieter still, and therefore crueler to her pride. Invitations ceased. Deverick patronage vanished. Doors that had opened because she might stand near a duke closed before her carriage wheels reached their thresholds. No one needed to shout scandal when absence could do the work. At Ravensholt Hall, Winifred's arrival was not arranged as a triumph. She had refused that. No servants lined the steps to perform forgiveness for the county. No neighbors came to admire the reunited Duke and Duchess as if public comfort were owed a display. Instead, the house received her in good order. Fires were lit. Her rooms had been prepared in the east wing, not sealed into the Duke's apartments by presumption. Her writing desk stood near a window overlooking a beach walk. On it lay estate papers awaiting her review, not flowers arranged to pretend nothing had happened. Elias stood at the threshold as she entered and did not follow until she looked back. "Is the room acceptable?" he asked. "It is honest," she said. "That is better than acceptable." His eyes lowered briefly, as if even small approval could still humble him. "I will not ask you to move any faster than truth allows, and if truth moves differently each day, then I will learn its pace." She turned toward him fully. In London, he had been a duke framed by chandeliers and certainty. At Larkmead, he had become a man mud-stained by repentance. Here, at Ravensholt, he was something harder to name, not forgiven without memory, not condemned without hope. Hers, perhaps, if he kept becoming worthy of the word. "You may dine with me tonight," she said. Warmth moved through his face before he controlled it. "I'm grateful." "Do not be too grateful. I intend to discuss drainage accounts. Then I shall endeavor to look besotted over drainage." The dry gentleness surprised a laugh from her, small but real. His expression changed at the sound, not with victory, but wonder. He did not step nearer. That restraint let the laughter live. A week later, they returned to Larkmead Chapel Yard, with no witness but Mrs. Fenby in the distance, and Mallow carrying a young myrtle, cutting wrapped at the roots. The afternoon was clear after rain. The old chapel stones held sunlight. Ivy shifted against the wall, and the path where Elias had once asked permission to steady her now lay dry beneath their feet. Winifred carried a copied prayer card, not the original. The original remained archived with the evidence, preserved beneath glass, because history should not be hidden when it had cost so much. This copy was written in her own hand. Beneath the prayer, she had added one line, "Let truth root where shame was planted." Elias knelt to dig the small hollow beside the path. His hands, gloved in plain leather, worked carefully through dark soil. Winifred watched him place aside each stone instead of forcing the spade through. Daily accountability, she had learned, was not dramatic. It lived in such choices. Ask first. Listen fully. Do not cover harm with rank. Set stones aside if roots required room. When the hollow was ready, she wrapped the prayer card in oilcloth and placed it at the bottom. Elias looked up at her. "Are you certain?" "Yes, not to bury it." She touched the small bundle once, to let it witness quietly. Together, they set the myrtle cutting above it and pressed soil around the roots. Their hands brushed in the earth. This time neither withdrew from hurt. Winifred let her fingers rest against his, then turned her palm upward. Elias took her hand with the reverence of a man who knew touch was not possession. Even now, they stood beside the young plant while the wind moved through the chapel grass. "I crossed England thinking apology was a destination," he said quietly. "It was only the road to the first door I had to knock upon." "You did knock," she said. Eventually, his mouth softened. A gracious correction, an accurate one. He looked at their joined hands. "I love you, Winifred." Still without claim, still without command, she stepped closer by her own choice. "And I love you, Elias." Still with memory, still with expectation. "Good," he said, voice roughening. "Expect much of me." "I intend to." She lifted her face, and because he had learned, he waited. The last distance belonged to her. Winifred closed it. The kiss was gentle, unhurried, and bright, with the peace that comes not from forgetting pain, but from seeing it answered. When she drew back, he remained close, his forehead nearly touching hers, his hand steady around hers. No room watched, no tenant needed proof, no villain remained to expose. "Shall we go home?" he asked. Winifred looked toward Larkmead Priory, where she had arrived as an exile and stood now as protector. Then she looked toward the road that led to Ravensholt, where a marriage waited to be lived honestly rather than displayed. "Yes," she said, "but not away from here," with here remembered. They walked down the chapel path hand in hand, not hurried, not hiding. Behind them, the young myrtle cutting stirred in the spring wind, its settling into the soil above the prayer card that had once proved a duchess innocent and now kept witness beneath new life. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.